You enter the world in England around the 1600s with all the ceremony of someone dropping their shopping basket, loudly, suddenly, and with the immediate hope that everything inside survived. Birth wasn't a milestone, it was a gamble, and nobody was confident enough to bet on it. Your mother was likely giving birth at home, not because it felt cosy, but because hospitals at this point were places people went to die, not to begin life. A midwife, usually the most experienced woman in the community, not someone with formal training, presided over the event. She carried herbs, charms, oils, and the kind of confidence that comes from having delivered dozens of babies and losing only some of them. In the 1600s, this counted as both a resume and a prophecy. Before we step into childhood in England around the 1600s, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're joining this journey into everyday life in the past. The birthing room itself was prepared like a small battlefield. Curtains drawn to create warmth, water boiling, a bed positioned for strategic access, and women gathered to support your mother through the process. These women range from actual relatives to neighbours who arrive for both moral support and the latest gossip. If you thought birth was about you, it wasn't. It was a social event with high stakes and absolutely no refreshments. As labour began, your mother was expected to tough it out with a level of endurance that modern humans only demonstrate while waiting for a slow microwave. Pain relief did exist, but it was mostly herbal, symbolic, or deeply disappointing. Some women chewed on cloves, others grasped religious relics or knotted cloths. Anesthesia wouldn't become a polite suggestion for another 2 centuries, so in the 1600s, your main pain management strategy was don't think about it too much. The midwife's job required skills that blurred the line between medicine and improvisation. She monitored your mother's pulse, breathing, and colour, though monitoring was less science and more instinct. She repositioned your mother if labour wasn't progressing, massaged her abdomen to encourage contractions, and whispered prayers when she suspected divine intervention might be more effective than anything she could actually do. Tools were minimal: a birthing stool, linens, and whatever she needed to cut the cord. Let's just say sterilisation was not a recognisable word, let alone a priority. Once you finally emerged, screaming, slippery and shocked, you had already passed your first exam. You breathed. Not all babies did. There was often a moment of silent, collective holding of breath as everyone watched to see if you had taken your first one. And when you did, oh, the relief in the room was enormous, but temporary. The good news? You were born. The bad news? No one relaxed yet. You would have been quickly rubbed down with warmed cloths, perhaps washed in a shallow basin, or simply wiped clean, depending on the midwife's preference and the household's resources. Some households swaddled infants tightly, thinking it protected fragile limbs. Others used looser wrappings. But all believed one thing: babies were fragile creatures held together by hope, cloth, and maybe divine oversight. Your first minutes of life were a rapid checklist: breathing, colour, movement. Crying was a positive sign, proof you intended to stick around. Silence was terrifying. Weak movement was concerning. And if you were born early, small, or looked not quite right, there was a communal shift in the room. People understood the odds. Children died often, but that did not mean anyone accepted it lightly. They just carried emotional armour the way you might carry a coat in winter. Necessary, heavy, and worn without comment. Your mother received immediate care too, but again, care meant warm drinks, rest if allowed, and the comforting presence of other women. She had just survived labour in an era where childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women. When she held you for the first time, she did so with love, fear, and the exhausted hope that this tiny, squirming person would not vanish. Baptism often happened within days, sometimes within hours, because waiting too long felt like tempting cosmic fate. A soul, after all, needed protection. The church played the role of spiritual insurance provider, and families lined up to make sure their newborns were officially listed under claimed by heaven. Even after baptism, your survival depended on constant vigilance. Infants died from cold, infection, feeding difficulties or accidents. Homes were filled with open flames, wooden furniture, uneven floors, and a rotating cast of siblings who may or may not have understood that babies were not indestructible toys. In the first weeks, everyone watched you with a hopeful intensity that might feel flattering if it weren't also deeply stressful. If you made it past the first month, people began to exhale, slightly. If you made it to your first birthday, they exhaled a little more. Early modern England didn't give families the luxury of assuming their children would survive. Instead, survival felt like an ongoing negotiation with fate. But right now, in this moment, you're here. You're breathing. You're wrapped tightly like a very small, very confused burrito. You have a name, a family, and the most fragile claim on a future. No one is celebrating with confidence, but everyone is quietly hopeful. You survived your birth. Now the real test begins. If being born was the first test, then surviving long enough to be considered a child was the second. In 1600s England, nobody declared you a toddler because you took a cute step or learned to babble. Childhood didn't arrive with age, it arrived with proof. You had to demonstrate through continuous stubborn survival that you were sticking around. Only then did people begin to adjust their expectations from fragile maybe baby to small person who might contribute someday. For the first months of your life, adults watched you the way sailors watch the weather, constantly, cautiously, and with absolutely no trust. Every cough was suspicious. Every quiet moment was borderline terrifying. If you slept too peacefully, someone checked to make sure you were still breathing. If you cried too loudly, they wondered what danger you sensed that they didn't. You weren't celebrated. You were monitored. Emotion came later, maybe. Your first major milestone was making it through the dangerous period of infancy, which for many households was roughly the first year of life. If you reached that point, the atmosphere around you changed. People didn't relax. 1600s, England didn't really do relaxation, but they began to invest emotionally the way someone slowly invests in a house after first checking it isn't full of termites. Your survival wasn't just noted, it was acknowledged. Congratulations, you existed with slightly more confidence. By this stage, you were gaining mobility, which meant the opportunities for disaster multiplied dramatically. Crawling was your first act of independence and the household's first logistical nightmare. Homes were full of things that were sharp, hot, toxic, or all three. Fireplaces glowed invitingly. Heavy wooden furniture had corners designed exclusively to bruise foreheads. Chambers of water for washing sat open and ready for misadventure. In the 1600s, baby-proofing didn't exist. The only safety measure was speed, specifically whether an adult could reach you before you discovered a new and creative way to injure yourself. As you began to walk, you entered the phase historians gently describe as early childhood, and parents of the time might have described as constant supervision disguised as affection. Walking, in theory, made life easier. Walking in reality meant knocking over jars, chasing livestock, falling into gardens, waddling toward open flames, and escaping into the yard whenever an adult looked away for half a second. Early childhood was defined not by cute developmental phases, but by the increasing number of hazards you learned to navigate without eliminating yourself from the family roster. Because emotional attachment followed your odds of survival, your family began treating you less like a temporary guest and more like someone who might one day develop opinions. This didn't mean affection was absent, it simply meant affection was cautious. Parents in this era were painfully aware that children could vanish from life with shocking speed. They cared deeply, but they armoured those feelings with distance, practicality, and a certain stoic resignation. They loved you, but they loved you while knowing the world might not. As you grew sturdier, the household gradually loosened its hold on you. You were allowed to toddle around the cottage, explore the yard, or follow older siblings to nearby fields, always under scrutiny, but with the understanding that you were beginning to acquire the basic skills of staying alive. This period wasn't about teaching you knowledge, it was about teaching you existence. You learned what was dangerous, what was allowed, what could be touched, and what absolutely could not be touched unless you wished to experience consequences. And let's talk about consequences. Discipline in this era wasn't reserved for older children. It began early, often before you fully grasped cause and effect. Adults used stern looks, sharp tones, and swift gestures to communicate what was off limits. They weren't trying to be harsh. They were trying to keep you alive in a world where death had an open invitation to every household. If you wandered near the fire, someone snatched you back. If you grabbed something fragile, someone tapped your hand. If you toddled toward the door, someone blocked your path like a medieval bouncer. Gradually, milestone by milestone, you expanded your little orbit. You learned which animals tolerated small humans and which animals absolutely did not. You discovered which plants tasted terrible and which plants tasted worse. You learned the sound of your mother's voice when she was worried versus when she was annoyed. Two things you were already becoming very skilled at provoking. By age 3 or 4, you had passed enough survival checkpoints that you were no longer considered a temporary miracle. You were now a functioning member of the household, even if your primary function was existing while supervised. Adults began speaking of you as someone with a future. You were given simple tasks to practice responsibility, carrying small items, handing tools to adults, shooing chickens out of doorways, or picking herbs that absolutely everyone believed you couldn't ruin. These weren't chores. They were evidence that you were becoming a person who might eventually provide labour. This shift, from survival to usefulness, marked the true beginning of childhood in the 1600s. Not the moment you were born, or the moment you took your first step, but the moment adults stopped glancing at you with fear and began glancing at you with expectation. It was subtle, but profound. You had proven you were staying on this earth long enough to matter. So congratulations again. Not only were you born, but you refused to leave. You clung to life through its sharp corners, open flames and lurking hazards. Childhood didn't begin with celebration. It began with relief. And relief, in 1600s England, was the closest thing to a party you were going to get. Sleep, in 1600s England, was not a private retreat. It was a team sport. If you picture yourself tucked into a soft little crib, drifting peacefully beneath a quilt your grandmother lovingly stitched just for you, erase that image immediately. Your first bed wasn't really a bed. It was whatever space your family had available and whatever material they could gather. Comfort was optional. Proximity was guaranteed. If your family lived in a small cottage, and most did, the main sleeping area doubled as a bedroom, living room, storage zone, an emergency barn whenever the weather bullied the livestock indoors. You didn't have your own room. You didn't even have your own mattress. You had a designated area, which changed depending on who needed the space most urgently at any given moment. Privacy, as far as your childhood was concerned, was a rumour someone invented centuries later. In many households, infants slept in cradle boards or simple wooden cradles near the parents' bed. Not because your parents were sentimental, though they might have been, but because you were a fragile creature with a persistent habit of needing things at inconvenient hours. Sleeping near you meant less stumbling across the dark cottage when you decided the night was over at 2 a.m. And if you weren't in a cradle, you might have been wrapped tightly in swaddling cloth and placed beside your mother, both to keep warm and to keep you from rolling into trouble. But as you grew into early childhood, your sleeping arrangement became less structured. Soft surfaces were rare luxuries. Most beds were stuffed with straw, feathers, wool, or whatever mix the household could afford. Straw was the most common, although its main benefit was that it existed. Feathers were prized but expensive. Wool stuffing was warm but heavy. In all cases, the materials flattened quickly and required regular turning or replacement, tasks that always seemed to happen after they were desperately needed. And then there was the mattress covering. Linen sheets, maybe, if your family had enough money to weave or buy proper cloth. But many children, slept directly on coarse blankets, spare tunics, or whatever fabric pieces survived the household's ongoing battle with wear and tear. Your bedding was pragmatic. You slept not where it was softest, but where you fit. The concept of sleeping alone simply didn't apply to you. Most households arranged their sleeping spaces horizontally, not individually. Families shared beds because beds were expensive, rooms were few, warmth was precious, and nobody believed that solitude was necessary for healthy emotional development. You slept beside siblings, cousins, or whoever happened to occupy your assigned corner. Age differences did not matter. The goal was to use body heat with the efficiency of a livestock herd. If you slept near siblings, you learned early that sharing warmth came with mandatory inconveniences. Someone always kicked in their sleep. Someone always snored. Someone always hogged the blanket, even when that blanket barely deserved to be called a blanket. And if one child woke up crying, frightened, hungry, cold, or bored, congratulations, everyone woke up. You didn't sleep alone. No one did. In larger or slightly wealthier households, the sleeping situation expanded into multiple beds, or a loft where older children slept. Lofts sounded romantic only to people who never lived in one. They were drafty in winter, boiling in summer, loud year-round, and completely uninsulated. The advantage? You got to sleep upstairs, which made you feel important until you realised upstairs was just a wooden platform with holes that allowed heat, sound, dust, and the occasional falling object to travel freely. If your family was poorer, or if space was extremely tight, you slept on a pallet on the floor. A pallet was simply a thin bundle of straw tied or stuffed inside cloth. It flattened overnight and needed fluffing in the morning, which absolutely no child ever did willingly. Floor sleepers were closest to the cold, closest to the drafts, and closest to the family dog, who considered every pallet a personal invitation. Speaking of animals, the boundary between human and livestock sleeping zones in rural cottages was flexible. If it was cold, sheep, goats, or chickens might be kept indoors for warmth or protection. This meant you occasionally fell asleep to the soothing sounds of clucking, bleating, or something chewing very loudly beside you. In your earliest years, you likely found this normal. Adults found it unavoidable. Hygiene found it regrettable. Nighttime itself was never completely silent. Homes were alive with noises, the shifting of furniture, the crackle of a dying fire, the wind pressing through thin boards, the rustlings of other sleepers adjusting their limbs or negotiating more blanket. Privacy didn't exist in the modern sense. Your dreams were your own, but everything else was shared. Air, space, blankets, and the chorus of nocturnal household sounds. There was, however, one advantage to communal sleeping: warmth. England could be brutally cold, and fireplaces were not kept burning all night unless someone wanted to risk a house fire or the entire family's future savings in firewood. So the shared bed was not simply practical, it was survival. You grew up learning that the human body was both the world's least predictable sleeping companion and its most effective heating system. By the time you reached age 6 or 7, you had adapted thoroughly to this arrangement. You no longer questioned why everyone slept together. You questioned why anyone wouldn't. Solitude sounded eerie. Separate rooms sounded suspicious. Beds for individuals sounded extravagant enough to draw divine scrutiny. In 1600s England, sleep wasn't about comfort. It was about making it through the night without freezing, without rolling into a fire, without waking the entire household, and without losing your share of the blanket war waged silently every evening. So yes, your first bed wasn't really a bed. It was a shared, shifting, slightly itchy, occasionally noisy sleeping ecosystem. And if you were lucky, you woke up warm, alive, and only mildly kicked. That counted as a good night. Your childhood wardrobe in 1600s England was not a curated collection of adorable outfits. It wasn't even your wardrobe. It was a rotating archive of whatever garments survived the last generation of children, shirts that had outlived 3 siblings, gowns older than some marriages, and woolen stockings that were more whole than stocking. Clothing wasn't about expressing your individuality. It was about not freezing to death. If it fit, it worked. If it didn't, you wore it anyway. The first thing to understand is that children didn't have separate fashion categories. There was no boys' wear or girls' wear in the early years. Every child, yes, every child wore gowns, loose, long garments that looked vaguely like dresses to a modern eye, practical, unisex, and effortlessly humiliating in hindsight. But for 1600s parents, gowns were genius, easy to put on, easy to remove, and easy to clean when childhood did what childhood always does, ruin things. The materials of these gowns varied depending on your family's income. The poorest children wore coarse wool, linen, or blends that scratched enough to become a form of character building. Wealthier households had finer fabrics, but even those were stiff, heavy, and prone to staining. Comfort was theoretical. Durability was the goal, and regardless of class, you absolutely wore clothing until it physically disintegrated. Once you outgrew the gown, usually around age 6 or 7, you breeched if you were a boy, meaning you finally graduated into wearing breeches instead of gowns. This was a major milestone, celebrated with more enthusiasm than your birthday. Boys received breeches, doublets, stockings, and sometimes miniature versions of adult men's clothing. Girls transitioned into bodices, petticoats, aprons, and caps that signalled their new status as small apprentices in domestic life. But even these milestone garments were rarely new. They were resewn, rehemmed, and reimagined from the remains of the earlier outfits. Hand-me-downs weren't a temporary solution. They were the clothing system. Every garment had previous owners, possibly several, and carried the faint memory of someone else's life, sometimes literally, in the form of stains or patched tears. When your parents handed you clothing, it wasn't, "Here's something for you." It was, "Here's something that has survived long enough to be useful again." You learned early that clothing did not adjust to you, you adjusted to it. Sleeves were rolled up when they swallowed your hands. Hems were let out when they suddenly hovered above your knees. Waistbands were tightened with ties, knots, and prayer. Sometimes a garment simply didn't fit at all. Did that stop you? Absolutely not. You wore it anyway, because the only alternative was wearing nothing, which was frowned upon in most social contexts. Laundry, in case you imagine crisp freshness and lavender scents, was a full-body commitment. Clothes were washed infrequently, scrubbed with lye-based soaps that burned the skin and dried in open air. Colours faded, fabric stiffened. Delicate clothing became rough. Rough clothing became armour. Children's garments, already worn thin from years of previous use, had even shorter lifespans once subjected to your daily adventures. Mud, soot, puddles, climbing, chasing animals, and discovering new ways to get dirty that no adult predicted. Cold weather made clothing even more urgent. Winter in England was not an aesthetic, snowy postcard. It was a long negotiation with frostbite. Children wore multiple layers of wool, linen, and whatever scraps could trap heat. These layers were heavy, itchy, and not especially effective. Staying warm required fire, body heat, movement, and a certain level of emotional resilience. But removing layers indoors meant risking chills, so you often spent the day sweating in wool like a very small, very confused sheep. Heat in summer didn't bring relief. Your clothing didn't become lighter, your suffering just changed temperature. Wool and linen trapped warmth, and expectations for modesty meant you couldn't remove much without scandalizing your family or the church. Children adapted by moving slower, finding shade, and complaining just enough that adults noticed but not enough to be scolded. Accessories weren't fun statements of style, they were tools. Caps kept your head warm and your hair, such as it was, contained. Aprons caught crumbs, soot, and your own general chaos. Shoes, if you had them, were sturdy leather objects meant to endure terrain, not comfort. Many children went barefoot for most of the year, not because it was whimsical, but because shoes wore out faster than parents could replace them. Bare feet were simply practical until winter insisted otherwise. As you grew older, you learned basic garment repair, not as a hobby, as a survival requirement. Children were taught to mend their own clothing, helping to stitch torn seams, reattach buttons, or reinforce weak patches. Every fix extended the life of a garment by a few days, weeks, or, miraculously, months. A child who could sew was a child who saved their family money, and money was never abundant enough to ignore. Clothing also carried social meaning. Even the youngest children absorbed the visual cues, the fabric that indicated wealth, the apron that indicated labour, the cap that indicated respectability. You learned where you fit in the social order before you even understood the concept of social order. Adults assessed families by the condition of their clothing, how patched, how faded, how carefully maintained. Your garments didn't express your personality, they expressed your economic reality. But despite the stiffness, the itching, the heaviness, the questionable fit, and the years of previous owners embedded in the fibres, your clothing did its job. It protected you from cold, from weather, from rough surfaces, from judgment, and occasionally from your own enthusiasm. So no, your childhood wardrobe wasn't stylish. It wasn't new. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't even truly yours. But it kept you alive long enough to grow up. And in 1600s England, that made it the best outfit you could possibly wear. Waking up in 1600s England meant two things. The air was cold and your stomach was empty. Not empty in the dramatic modern sense, where you skip breakfast and declare a national emergency, but empty in the practical daily life sense, where yesterday's dinner was modest and your body had zero interest in pretending otherwise. Breakfast didn't energize you, it acknowledged you. The morning meal was not a spread of eggs, meats, pastries, or anything else that might qualify as indulgent. It was porridge. Always porridge. Sometimes made from oats, sometimes barley, sometimes wheat, and occasionally from whatever grains were cheapest or most available. It was a thick, vaguely edible sludge that existed not because people admired its flavour, but because it was the most reliable way to keep families alive. Your breakfast bowl reflected the household economy. If times were good, meaning the harvest hadn't failed, prices weren't sky high, and rats hadn't held a festival in your grain store, your porridge might contain a pinch of salt or a drizzle of leftover broth. In rare moments of luxury, it might even include a scrap of butter or a spoonful of milk. These additions transformed your breakfast from edible glue into edible glue with personality. Most days, though, your porridge was plain, spectacularly plain. It was a food you ate because it existed and you existed, and the two of you had an unspoken agreement to meet every morning whether you liked each other or not. Breakfast happened early. The sun barely peeked over the horizon before you were ushered to the table, or whatever served as a table, and handed a wooden bowl. Children were not encouraged to complain about hunger, temperature, texture, or the existential disappointment of eating the same thing every day. Adults weren't complaining either. Everyone accepted porridge the way you accept rain. Annoying, but part of life. Eating wasn't leisurely, it was strategic. The household had work to begin, and dawdling over breakfast wasn't an option. Farm families needed daylight for animals and fields. Urban families needed daylight for apprenticeships, workshops, and merchant stalls. Children had chores to do, siblings to mind, or early education to attend. No one sat around savouring flavour notes or discussing the mouthfeel of barley. You ate quickly, quietly, and enough to prevent collapse. If you were lucky, your porridge was warm. Firewood was precious, and fuel was rationed, carefully. That meant the morning pot simmered only briefly, often heated just enough to soften the grains and prevent your spoon from bending. Cold porridge wasn't a tragedy. It was normal, and on bitter winter mornings, warm porridge doubled as a hand warmer until you worked up the courage to eat it. Breakfast portions were not generous. Food scarcity was a fact of life, and every household calculated supplies with the skills of reluctant accountants. Children received enough to keep them alive and functional, but never enough for comfort. The goal wasn't fullness. The goal was survival until the midday meal, which was often the real event of the day, and depended heavily on fortune, season, and the unpredictable cooperation of crops and animals. Children learned early not to ask for more. More wasn't available. A too quickly emptied bowl meant someone else ate less, and that someone was probably working a physically demanding job. Your morning appetite bowed, respectfully, to the household hierarchy. The porridge itself changed with the seasons. In summer, when grains were fresher and cooking was easier, the consistency was lighter. In winter, when everything edible felt like it was trying to escape existence, the porridge thickened to a paste that clung to the bowl with alarming tenacity. Stirring it required determination, upper body strength, and emotional stamina. Flavour was a luxury. Sweeteners like honey were expensive. Sugar existed, but only as a fantasy for most households. Spices were luxuries for wealthy families, not everyday people. So the taste of porridge remained consistent across your entire childhood. Grain, sometimes salty grain, sometimes a watered-down grain, sometimes grain with a personality crisis, but always undeniably grain. While breakfast itself was simple, the rituals around it revealed the rhythm of early modern life. Families often recited prayers before eating, thanking God for the meal, no matter how humble it was. Gratitude wasn't optional. In a world where food security fluctuated constantly, acknowledging each meal reinforced a shared understanding. Eating was never guaranteed. You learned to be thankful for your bowl of beige mush because the alternative was hunger, and hunger showed up often enough to make porridge look heroic. Older children occasionally helped stir the pot or fetch water for cooking. Even these small tasks taught responsibility and the precariousness of food preparation. Every grain mattered, every crumb mattered. When you're one bad harvest away from scarcity, waste becomes a sin and a luxury simultaneously. Breakfast also reinforced social order. Adults ate first or received larger portions, depending on the household. Children knew their place without being told. Sitting quietly, eating steadily, and avoiding spills was a sign that you understood the unspoken rules that governed daily life. By the time you finished your bowl, the day had already begun. Your stomach wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. You were ready, not energized, not enthusiastic, but ready to step into your routine. Breakfast didn't promise joy, it didn't offer delight, but it acknowledged your existence, handed you the bare minimum, and nudged you into the world. You weren't eating to thrive, you were eating to continue. And in 1600s England, continuation was the greatest luxury of all. Play existed in your childhood, absolutely, but only in the spaces life forgot to fill. In 1600s England, play was not an entitlement, not a developmental philosophy, and certainly not a category of life protected by adults. It was a momentary pause between tasks, the breath you took before someone handed you another chore. You played between responsibilities. Toys, for the most part, were not carefully crafted treasures. If you came from a poor household, and most children did, your toys were whatever the environment dropped at your feet. Sticks that became swords, stones that became sheep, scraps of cloth that turned into dolls, or a bit of string that could be twisted into a surprisingly captivating puzzle. Childhood imagination was the only manufacturer with consistent supply. Wealthier families could afford proper toys, wooden horses, carved animals, dolls with painted faces, small drums, even miniature furniture. But these items were not common enough to represent most children's lives. If you ever held a real toy, you treated it with the reverence reserved for relics and breakable objects in homes with limited patience for repairs. The average child's toy collection was more improvised. Games were communal activities, passed from older children to younger ones through demonstration rather than instruction. You learned games by doing, or more accurately, by being dragged into situations where older children needed opponents, teammates, or someone to blame if the game ended in tears. Running games, simple chasing, games, hide-and-seek variants, and contests of strength or balance filled the time when adults weren't watching, or when adults were too busy to interrupt. Play might happen outside in the lanes or fields, where you could run without knocking into furniture or upsetting livestock. Rural children used the natural world as their playground. Hedges became mazes, trees became lookout towers, streams became adventure zones you were absolutely not supposed to fall into, but inevitably did. Urban children found entertainment in alleys, courtyards, market squares, and doorways. Playing in the streets came with the added excitement of dodging carts, horses, and adults who didn't consider children at play a compelling reason to slow down. But play was never the day's main attraction. Adults structured your hours around productivity, not enrichment, and your job was to adapt. If you were gathering firewood, you might pause to sword fight with a stick. If you were watching younger siblings, you invented games to keep them still long enough for you to stay out of trouble. If you were sent to fetch water, you might race another child to the well, pretending it was a heroic quest instead of basic household logistics. Play was woven into labour like embroidery into cloth, decorative, delightful, and always dependent on available time. Children did not spend long afternoons lounging, crafting stories, or planning elaborate games. Opportunities for play arrived unpredictably and ended abruptly the moment an adult called your name with a certain tone. The tone that meant, stop doing whatever you're doing and come help. Even when toys were simple, children poured worlds into them. A stick could become a plough, a horse, or a weapon. A little cloth bundle tied with twine became a baby, carried and rocked with a seriousness that revealed what adulthood would demand. Your play often mimicked the labour you saw around you. You pretended to cook because you watched adults cook. You pretended to herd animals because you watched adults herd animals. Even imaginative play rehearsed responsibility. Your childhood was preparing you for your future, quietly and without ceremony. Seasonal variations shaped your play too. Summer offered more opportunities. Long light, warmer weather, and outdoor spaces where your mistakes were less likely to break anything valuable. Winter play was limited by cold, darkness, and the fact that everything indoors could be knocked over, spilled, or set on fire by accident. Many children resorted to quiet games, string puzzles, riddles, carving small toys, simple distractions that didn't threaten household peace. Though toys were limited, laughter was not. Children created fun with the same ingenuity they used to survive the rest of their lives. You learned to find joy in tiny moments, rolling hoops made from stripped branches, tossing stones in patterns only you understood, making whistles from reeds, or engaging in dramatic storytelling with other children who brought boundless enthusiasm and very questionable plot coherence. Adults sometimes tolerated play. They sometimes even encouraged it, if it shaped you into a useful adult. Running built endurance, climbing built strength. Team games taught cooperation. Imaginative games prepared you to imitate the adults you would eventually become. The line between play and work was blurry, not because adults weren't paying attention, but because the two were never truly separate in the first place. Competition existed, but rewards were symbolic. Winning meant pride, not prizes. Losing meant shrugging it off before someone reminded you it was time to go sweep the floor, grind grain, or carry water. In a world where life asked much from children, play taught resilience more effectively than lectures ever could. And while modern childhood often emphasizes individuality, your play was shaped by community. Children moved as groups, siblings, cousins, neighbours, all forming tiny societies with their own rules, hierarchies and negotiations. Conflicts were frequent, brief and educational. You learned to share because toys were scarce. You learned patience because adults were busy. You learned creativity because materials were limited. You learned compromise because storming off dramatically only worked until someone reminded you that chores waited at home. Play did not define your childhood in 1600s England. Work did. But play threaded itself through your days in small, bright flashes, spontaneous, joyful, fleeting. You didn't have toys, you had resourcefulness. You didn't have free time, you had stolen moments. And in those moments, even with hunger, cold, and responsibility pressing at the edges of your world, you found joy, raw, simple, unmanufactured joy. Because before adulthood claimed you, you still had the instinct to pretend. You played between responsibilities. In 1600s England, education was not a universal right. It wasn't even a strong suggestion. It was more like a door that remained partially open, but only for certain people at certain times, for reasons that usually had very little to do with enlightenment. If you were a child in this era, what you learned depended almost entirely on what your family needed, what your social class permitted, and how much labour you could be spared from at home. Education was optional. Obedience was not. The first thing to understand is that schools existed, but childhood attendance was inconsistent at best. Many children received no formal schooling at all. If your family struggled financially, and most did, the idea of sending you off to sit indoors and write letters while your household needed help, gathering firewood, minding younger siblings, or contributing to income was laughable. You weren't an educational investment, you were a workforce in training. But if you did attend school, your experience depended heavily on what kind of school it was. For many children, especially boys, the most accessible form of education was the petty school, run by a local teacher, often inside their own home, with a teaching style that blended basic literacy with whatever disciplinary methods the teacher personally favoured. These schools taught reading, writing, spelling, and moral instruction, all wrapped in the understanding that discipline was not a gentle suggestion, but a pedagogical pillar. Books were precious and expensive, so lessons relied heavily on the hornbook, a wooden paddle with a single sheet displaying the alphabet, Lord's Prayer, and sometimes a few syllables to practice. The sheet was covered by a thin piece of horn to protect it, hence the name. This tool was used to introduce literacy, but literacy itself was not the educational priority. The priority was obedience. As long as you sat quietly, repeated lessons, and did not cause chaos, you were considered a successful student. If you were a girl, your chances of formal education were lower. Some girls learned to read, especially in Protestant households where reading scripture was valued. But writing was considered unnecessary for most girls. Reading was a useful moral tool, while writing was a skill associated with legal matters, business, and public affairs, places girls were not expected to participate. Many girls learned instead through domestic apprenticeship, cooking, sewing, managing a household, and performing tasks that kept daily life functioning. Their education was informal but essential, structured by repetition rather than textbooks. Grammar schools offered more rigorous instruction for boys preparing for higher study or clerical careers. These schools emphasized Latin, because apparently the best way to prepare children for adulthood was to teach them a dead language they could use to impress priests. Grammar school students spent long hours memorizing declensions, reciting verb tables and translating texts without any guarantee they understood what they were translating. Thought was secondary. Memory was everything. You weren't taught to think. You were taught to listen. And listening wasn't optional. School discipline was strict, often enforced with the rod, the birch, or whatever tool the teacher believed most effective for shaping young minds. In the 1600s, physical punishment wasn't viewed as harsh. It was viewed as structurally necessary. Lessons were repeated aloud until drilled into memory. Errors were corrected swiftly and loudly. Silence was treated as virtue. Talking out of turn was treated as rebellion. Children learned quickly that education was not a conversation. It was an instruction manual delivered at high volume. For those who showed exceptional promise, or whose families had exceptional money, private tutors were the next step. Tutors were hired to instruct children in languages, mathematics, rhetoric, and occasionally philosophy. But even here, the emphasis remained on obedience, discipline, and producing a polished adult rather than an inquisitive one. Curiosity was not discouraged exactly, but it wasn't particularly fed either. Useful knowledge was the priority, and useful had a very narrow definition. Literacy rates varied dramatically by region and gender. Many rural children grew up without learning to read at all, because the skills they needed for adulthood centered on farming, trading, or artisan work, none of which required literacy. Urban children were more likely to encounter reading and writing, but even there, instruction was inconsistent. The expectation was not that every child should read. The expectation was that every child should behave. One of the most important forms of education came not from schools, but from churches. Sunday sermons functioned as public instruction. Children listened to scripture, moral lessons, and community expectations. Church attendance was mandatory, and so was paying attention. Even if you didn't understand everything, or anything, you learned through repetition what concepts were valued: obedience, humility, order, and avoiding sin even when sin seemed more interesting. Outside of church, most practical knowledge came from watching adults. You learned how to sweep a hearth by sweeping it badly the first time. You learned how to prepare food by standing where you were told, and doing your best not to drop anything. You learned to handle tools by mimicking older siblings or parents who did not have time to give lectures. Life itself was the school. The curriculum was survival. The exam was adulthood. Education in the 1600s wasn't designed to expand your world. It was designed to fit you into it. If you learned to read, wonderful. If you learned to write, exceptional. But literacy was not your destiny. Usefulness was. Families valued children who followed rules, performed tasks, and upheld order. Thinking independently, that was for philosophers or troublemakers. So while some pockets of English society encouraged education, most children's schooling was limited, selective, and shaped by economic necessity. You were taught enough to function, enough to obey, and enough to know your place. And if you happened to learn letters along the way, that was simply a convenient bonus. Because in 1600s England, education wasn't the path to freedom or opportunity. It was the path to becoming exactly what your household needed you to be. In 1600s England, discipline wasn't a quiet conversation. It wasn't a teaching moment spoken gently across a kitchen table. And it certainly wasn't an opportunity for a child to explain what they meant to do. Mistakes weren't discussed. They were corrected. Correction arrived quickly, decisively, and often loudly. To understand discipline in this era, you must set aside any modern ideas about childhood innocence or emotional development. Children were not treated as fragile beings whose feelings required protection. They were treated as malleable creatures who needed shaping, and shaping in 1600s England came through a combination of authority, fear, ritual, and the occasional wooden object applied with conviction. Corporal punishment was not a last resort. It was a daily tool. Everyone believed this. Parents, teachers, clergy, neighbours, strangers who caught you doing something questionable. The consensus was universal. Pain, delivered swiftly, was the most effective teacher. Children learned boundaries not through explanation, but through impact. A wrong move earned a flick, a slap, a switch across the legs, or a cuff to the back of the head. Not violently, just efficiently. Adults rarely paused to consider whether the punishment matched the crime. They simply acted because the goal was immediate course correction. A slow response meant the child might learn the wrong lesson, like, I can get away with this for a few more seconds, and that was unacceptable. And discipline wasn't confined to the household. It was communal. If you misbehaved in public, a marketplace, a street, a churchyard, any adult present felt deputized to intervene. Maybe they grabbed your arm. Maybe they scolded you loudly enough that 3 towns over could hear. Maybe they gave you a sharp tap with whatever they were holding. Adults policed children with the confidence of people who firmly believed the universe supported their decisions. Parents didn't protest. If someone corrected their child, the parent thanked them. Or, more likely, added another layer of correction on top of the first one just to demonstrate solidarity with the universe. The church was another powerful force in your disciplinary education. Clergy did not concern themselves with mild, gentle warnings. They concerned themselves with sin, its recognition, its prevention, and its elimination, preferably in that order. From a young age, you were taught that misbehaviour wasn't simply inconvenient, it was spiritually dangerous. Wrong actions placed you on a slippery slope toward moral decay, divine displeasure, and, eventually, eternal consequences far worse than a birch across the calves. Fear of hell was considered a perfectly reasonable disciplinary strategy. Teachers took a similarly enthusiastic approach. A schoolmaster's rod was more than a tool. It was an institution, a symbol of authority, a reminder that if you forgot your lesson, mispronounced a Latin word, broke your quill, spoke out of turn, or breathed incorrectly at the wrong moment, you would feel consequences. Grammar school students joked, quietly, and never within a teacher's hearing, that the rod taught more than the books did. It certainly taught faster, and punishment wasn't private in schools. It was performed in front of the class so everyone could absorb the lesson. Watching another child get disciplined was considered valuable moral training. Sympathy was discouraged, empathy was suspicious. Learning, in this context, meant internalizing the message, do not follow that example. Schools treated discipline as a collective experience, like a theatrical performance in which pain played the lead role. At home, discipline varied by family, but the underlying philosophy remained the same. Correction should be clear, immediate, and unmistakable. Parents didn't deliver gentle reminders. They issued orders. They did not say, "Let's talk about your choices." They said, "Don't do that," followed by an action that ensured you never did it again. You learned not only what was forbidden, but why it was forbidden, because doing it hurt. Even minor mistakes earned swift responses. Spill a bowl? That was waste. Waste was sin. Expect correction. Backtalk? That was insolence. Insolence was disorder. Expect correction. Wander too far from the house? That was danger. Danger was unacceptable. Expect correction. And possibly additional chores because punishment doubled beautifully as productivity. Adults did not question whether strict discipline damaged children emotionally. They believed the opposite, that failing to discipline damaged children spiritually. A child left unchecked became a threat, not only to themselves, but to household stability and community order. Discipline wasn't cruelty, it was maintenance, and children absorbed this worldview early. You learned to read adult expressions with the speed of a professional interpreter. The narrowing of eyes meant trouble. A slight tilt of the head meant you were being evaluated. A pause before speaking meant you should immediately sit still, fold your hands, and reconsider every choice you had made that day. But discipline wasn't only physical. It was also verbal. Sharp rebukes, pointed comments, moral warnings. Adults use shame as freely as they use switches. What will the neighbours think? Was a question with real consequences, because neighbours might see, judge, or intervene. Your reputation as a child mattered because it reflected on your family's reputation as adults. You did not embarrass your household. You did not disappoint your elders. And if you forgot these rules, someone reminded you. Yet even with all this correction, children in 1600s England did not live in constant misery. They adapted. They understood the system. They learned to navigate adult expectations with agility. They became observant, quick-thinking, and, paradoxically, resilient. Discipline was a language, and once you understood its vocabulary, you could move through your world without setting off alarms. It wasn't kindness that shaped you. It wasn't encouragement. It was structure. Firm, loud, occasionally painful structure. And while modern sensibilities might recoil, children of the time didn't view discipline as unusual. It was simply how the world kept them in line, immediately, publicly, and with unmistakable clarity. In 1600s England, religion wasn't something you encountered, occasionally like a visiting relative. It lived in your house, walked with you to school, sat beside you at meals, and, most importantly, watched everything you did. God wasn't distant. God was nearby, very nearby, uncomfortably nearby, close enough to make you rethink every mischievous impulse you ever had. Before you could speak in full sentences, You were already absorbing the rhythms of religious life. Church bells marked your week like a celestial clock. Sundays weren't simply church days. They were the day when attendance wasn't optional, behaviour wasn't negotiable, and the sermon wasn't short. You learned quickly that the church building wasn't just a place to pray, it was a place to be seen praying. Your household, like most, viewed church attendance as an obligation, a duty to God, community, and social order. Even if your family lived far from the village centre, even if it was raining sideways, even if someone had been up half the night, tending to animals or illness, the expectation remained unchanged. You got up, put on the best clothing your family owned, meaning the least patched garments, and walked to church with whatever dignity your childhood legs could muster. Inside the church, you encountered a world that felt both enormous and intimate. Enormous because the vaulted ceilings, echoing voices and solemn music transformed ordinary space into something grand. Intimate because you were forced to sit still for long stretches of time while adults around you kept half an eye on you, ready to correct the slightest fidget. Nothing tested your physical endurance like trying not to wiggle during an hour-long sermon on the dangers of sin, and sin was everywhere. You didn't develop anxiety, you inherited it. From a young age, you learned that God was observing not just your actions, but your thoughts, intentions, and probably your facial expressions. Ministers spoke of temptation with such seriousness that you began to suspect temptation was hiding in your pocket. Sermons described hell with such vivid detail you briefly wondered if the minister had visited personally. And moral stories featured children who strayed slightly from the path and immediately faced consequences so dramatic they made discipline at home look like a light tap on the wrist. You did not grow up casually. You grew up careful. Religion shaped your understanding of right and wrong, but also of danger, responsibility, and fear. The church taught that sin wasn't merely a mistake. It was a spiritual stain, a disruption of cosmic order, and potentially a ticket to eternal suffering. Adults wanted you to internalize morality, and you did, but with a good helping of nightly reflection about whether you'd accidentally sinned by thinking too loudly. Prayer was woven into daily life. Morning prayers, evening prayers, blessings before meals, and silent prayers when something went wrong. You learned to fold your hands automatically, to bow your head instinctively, and to listen for cues from adults that signalled when a moment had shifted from ordinary time to holy time. But religion wasn't only fear, it was also community. The church brought neighbours together, hosted festivals, officiated baptisms and marriages, and served as a gathering place where gossip, announcements, alliances, and disputes all played out under the watchful eyes of the clergy. Even as a child, you sensed that church was less a building and more a stage on which the grand drama of daily life unfolded. You sat beside your family in the same pew every week, observing familiar faces. You watched older children try to appear pious while quietly nudging each other. You watched younger children succumb to wiggles, only to be gently, or not so gently, pulled back into line. You absorbed not just words but atmosphere. Religion wasn't a topic, it was an environment. Catechism, basic religious instruction, became part of your learning. You memorized questions and answers, recited verses and learned doctrinal truths even before you understood their meaning. Adults believed repetition engraved faith onto your soul, and indeed, you repeated the lessons so often they became part of your mental furniture. Familiar phrases stored beside nursery rhymes and household rules. The church calendar structured the year. Festivals like Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun offered rare moments of celebration. Lent brought solemnity. Saints' days and fast days reminded you that holiness wasn't occasional. It was constant, and you were expected to participate. Even the landscape reflected religious life. Wayside crosses, churchyards, and religious symbols embedded in architecture surrounded you daily. Religious rituals marked your personal milestones too. Your baptism was your first introduction to sacred community. Later, you would stand in church to recite verses or answer questions, proving that you had absorbed enough doctrine to be considered spiritually literate. Adults took these milestones seriously. Children took them seriously too, mostly because the idea of disappointing both God and the minister in the same moment felt like emotional catastrophe. The idea that God was always watching didn't terrify every child, but it certainly motivated them. You learned to say sorry even when unsure what you'd done wrong. You learned to avoid certain behaviours because sermons had convinced you that tiny missteps could lead to dramatic cosmic consequences. And you learned that silence, especially inside church, was a kind of spiritual armour. Yet, as much as religion instilled fear, it also offered comfort. Prayers soothed you when storms rattled the roof. Hymns wrapped the church in warmth on cold mornings. Stories from Scripture reassured you that even biblical heroes made mistakes, though they paid dearly for them. The divine presence that watched you also protected you, and you grew up believing both things wholeheartedly. God, you learned, was not only near during sermons or prayers. God was near when you woke, when you worked, when you rested, and when you wondered whether your mischievous thought about stealing an extra berry counted as sin. Religion didn't merely watch you grow, it shaped the way you understood the world, your place in it, and the unseen forces guiding your steps. And whether it comforted or frightened you on any given day, one thing was certain. You never grew up alone. God was always nearby, closer than your shadow, louder than your conscience, and infinitely more observant. In 1600s England, childhood did not end with a birthday, a ceremony, or a heartfelt conversation about responsibility. It ended the moment adults realised you could contribute. Not fully, not skillfully, not even willingly, but usefully enough. You didn't grow up suddenly. You were absorbed. Children weren't seen as creatures who needed long periods of exploration or self-discovery. They were small adults in progress, and once your survival seemed reasonably assured, adulthood began creeping into your daily life like a draft through the floorboards. Gentle at first, then impossible to ignore. One day you were a child playing with sticks. The next day, those sticks became tools you were expected to carry, stack, or fetch for someone older and louder. This transition wasn't dramatic, it was practical. Your household needed labour, and you had hands, tiny hands, clumsy hands, occasionally uncooperative hands, but hands nonetheless. A busy family didn't sit down and say, "You're old enough now." They said, "Take this," and whatever this was marked the end of your pure childhood. Age played a role, but ability played a bigger one. If you could walk reliably without falling into fires or ponds, congratulations. You were eligible for duties. Young children started small, given tasks that served more as early training than actual productivity. Sorting, fetching, carrying small bundles, standing watch over vegetable patches, not because of thieves, but because chickens and geese were anarchists. These were your first steps toward usefulness, and usefulness was the goal. The concept of childhood as a protected, carefree stage simply didn't exist for ordinary families. Every member of the household contributed to survival. You couldn't afford not to. A family's prosperity, or simply its ability to stay fed, depended on the labour of every able-bodied person, children included. Work wasn't a burden. It was the gravity that held the household together. By age 6 or 7, your responsibilities expanded. You learned to sweep floors, carry water, tend fires, gather herbs, assist with cooking, or mind younger siblings. You fed chickens, collected eggs, and learned which animals were gentle, and which animals acted like they resented your entire existence. You fetched items from storage or from neighbours' homes because your small legs navigated narrow lanes more quickly than larger adults burdened with work of their own. This creeping adulthood was steady, relentless, and mostly unquestioned. Children weren't asked whether they wanted more responsibilities. They were expected to shoulder them as a natural extension of growing larger and surviving longer. The idea that a child might not be emotionally ready for certain tasks wasn't considered. Emotional readiness was a modern invention. Survival readiness was the requirement. In wealthier households, childhood lingered slightly longer, cushioned by servants and tutors. But even there, expectations rose early. Noble boys might begin training in manners, Latin and estate management. Noble girls learned needlework, household oversight, and the subtle art of behaving perfectly in rooms full of judgment. Wealth insulated you from hunger, but not from the creeping expectations of adulthood. Even privilege had chores, just cleaner, quieter ones. For working families, the shift into usefulness often arrived abruptly. If a parent fell ill, you stepped in. If an older sibling married or left as an apprentice, the labour gap widened instantly. Children filled that gap without complaint, not because they enjoyed it, but because the alternative was the entire household suffering. You didn't learn responsibility. You became responsible through proximity. Adulthood seeped into your life through instruction as well. Adults explain tasks not through lengthy lessons, but through sharp demonstrations and simple commands. You learn to chop wood by watching someone chop wood. You learn to wash clothes by seeing someone scrub until their hands went numb. You learn to spin wool, bake bread, carry heavy loads, or prepare animals because adults perform these tasks constantly, and eventually you were nudged forward to try. And once you tried, you were expected to keep doing it. One sign you were no longer a small child was that adults stopped monitoring your every step. They trusted you not because you were mature, but because they had no choice. Trust in this era was often indistinguishable from exhaustion. The creeping nature of adulthood showed itself in how rarely you thought of yourself as a child once work became regular. You didn't wake up one morning feeling older. You woke up one morning and realized you had a list of tasks waiting for you. That list grew each year until it quietly blended into the duties expected of fully grown adults. By age 10 or 11, many children were effectively mini-workers. Girls might handle complex household management tasks. Boys might help in fields, workshops, or markets. You weren't grown, but you were positioned on the pathway so firmly that childhood, as a distinct chapter of life, blurred behind you. And then, without ceremony, adolescence arrived with more work, more expectations, and fewer excuses. You weren't too small anymore. You weren't too fragile. You weren't too young. You were increasingly useful, and usefulness was the currency of survival. It's tempting to imagine that childhood ended as soon as labour began, but that's not entirely true. You still played, laughed, made mischief, and found pockets of joy. But the ratio shifted. Play fit around work. Work did not fit around play. Your imagination lived in the spaces left unclaimed by duty. Childhood didn't vanish abruptly. It dissolved. Quietly. Gradually. Purposefully. You didn't grow up suddenly. You were absorbed. Pulled into the machinery of family, community, and necessity. And by the time you realized adulthood had crept in, you were already holding something important, carrying something heavy, or being trusted with something essential. In 1600s England, that was the moment you knew. Ready or not, you were no longer simply a child. Work in 1600s England was not something children eased into with a gentle introduction. It was not part of a growth experience, or a way to develop discipline and character. Those concepts would have confused your parents. Work was life. Work was survival. Work was the system that kept your family from collapsing under the weight of hunger, cold, and the unrelenting demands of daily existence. You weren't helping out. You were necessary. By the time you reached the age when you could reliably stand, walk, and follow a command without immediately wandering towards something dangerous, you became part of the household workforce, not symbolically, literally. You were expected to contribute, and your contribution was not a matter of pride or punishment. It was expected because without the labour of every available body, the household simply could not function. Your chores were assigned not based on interest or personal growth, but on practicality. What needed doing, who had the time, and who had the hands small enough to reach into inconvenient places. The good news was was that your size gave you certain advantages. The bad news was that your size gave you certain responsibilities. One of your early tasks might be fetching things: water, herbs, firewood, tools, or objects adults dropped and understandably refused to bend down for. Fetching was a perfect child task, simple enough not to cause disaster, important enough to save adults time, and endlessly repeatable. You might make 10 trips to the well before breakfast. Not because the family was unusually thirsty, but because the well was a long walk away and carrying water was easier for 5 small trips than 1 large one. As you grew older, your tasks grew with you. You learned how to sweep floors, not with modern precision, but with the historical standard of good enough so nobody slips on loose straw. You helped maintain the fire, adding kindling or watching the embers when adults stepped outside. You carried buckets, baskets, bundles of sticks, bundles of laundry, and sometimes bundles of siblings. Every job had weight, literally and figuratively. Your work was seasonal too. In summer, children helped with planting, weeding, harvesting, and airing out household goods. In winter, tasks shifted to wool carding, mending clothes, stirring soup, tending animals, and keeping the fire alive against the creeping cold. Seasonal work meant no season was restful. It simply brought new demands. On farms, children played a crucial role in managing livestock. Chickens needed feeding. Sheep needed herding. Cows needed milking, though that job usually fell to older children or adults with stronger hands and a higher tolerance for uncooperative animals. Geese were a special case. They were notoriously territorial and frequently angry for no discernible reason. Many children learned early that goose management required courage, agility, and a willingness to run when negotiations failed. Inside the household, work had its own ecosystem. You helped grind grain by hand, a task requiring steady rhythm and surprising strength. You stirred pots that felt as tall as you were. You gathered ingredients from gardens, fields, and hedgerows. Gathering wasn't as simple as plucking leaves. It required plant knowledge, knowing what was edible, what was useful, and what would make the entire household regret trusting you. And let's not forget the responsibility of minding younger siblings. Childcare was one of the most significant forms of labour you performed. You kept toddlers from falling into open fires, wandering into fields, or discovering the many sharp objects homes kept within reach. Your success rate varied depending on the child. Your patience varied depending on the day. But this work was essential, because every moment an adult didn't have to watch a toddler was a moment they could devote to keeping the household running. The most striking part of this system was how normal it felt to everyone involved. Children didn't question why they worked. Adults didn't explain why children worked. The arrangement was obvious. Survival economics demanded collaboration. When you chopped vegetables, you were preventing hunger. When you carried wood, you were preventing cold. When you helped clean, you were preventing disorder that could quickly turn into danger. Work didn't feel like a burden with deep philosophical implications. It felt like breathing, eating, and sleeping, another part of existence. Even urban children were deeply embedded in labour. Families running shops or workshops relied on children to perform small but vital tasks: sweeping storefronts, delivering goods, minding stalls when adults stepped away, sorting materials, prepping tools, or running messages around the neighbourhood. These tasks taught efficiency more than education, obedience more than innovation. And because work gave children purpose, adults seldom thanked them. Appreciation existed, but not in the form of verbal praise. It existed in trust, in being given more important responsibilities, in being allowed to handle tools, in being included in adult discussions about planting, repairs, or household strategy. Acknowledgement came quietly, through increased expectations, not applause. But while work dominated your days, it wasn't joyless. Children found moments of pride in tasks completed well. You felt important. You felt capable. You felt connected to the daily rhythm of the household and the companionship among children doing similar tasks. talking, joking, racing through chores, turned labour into something communal, something shared, something almost enjoyable if the weather cooperated and the tasks involved no biting animals. Work shaped your understanding of adulthood long before you reached it. You didn't dream of jobs in the abstract. You lived alongside the work adults performed and saw the direct link between effort and survival. The line between child and adult blurred because both carried burdens adjusted only by strength and experience. In 1600s England, work wasn't a stage of life or a stepping stone. It was a constant, and childhood was simply the period when you learned to perform it without dropping things or tripping. You weren't helping out. You were necessary, and that necessity defined not just your days, but your entire path toward adulthood. Leaving home in 1600s, England wasn't a dramatic rite of passage marked by speeches, tears, and inspirational advice. It was a practical decision made with the calm efficiency of someone sharpening a knife. Necessary, inevitable, and done without flourish. You left home young. Everyone did. Not because your parents didn't love you, but because childhood was short, adulthood was long, and the years in between belonged to someone else entirely, a master, a mistress, or a craft that expected loyalty and labour in equal measure. Apprenticeship was the bridge between being a child and being a person with skills, status, and, if you were lucky, food that wasn't porridge. It was one of the most common paths to adulthood for boys and increasingly for girls learning certain trades or domestic skills, and it often began shockingly early. Some children departed home at 7 or 8, many left by 10 or 11. If you reached 13 still sleeping under your parents' roof, someone in the village was probably wondering why you were still there. Your parents made the arrangements, negotiating the details with a master craftsman, farmer, merchant, or household matron. Apprenticeships were contracts, formal or informal, binding you to years of service in exchange for training, shelter, and the vague promise of a future. Emotion played little part in these negotiations. The master asked practical questions. The parents assessed the master's reputation, and you, the soon-to-be apprentice, silently wondered what on earth was happening and whether anyone planned to ask your opinion. Spoiler, they did not. The day you left home, your belongings fit into a small bundle, spare clothing, maybe a blanket, and whatever sentimental object you managed to sneak in without your siblings claiming it first. Travel was short for some, longer for others, but the emotional distance was enormous. You weren't going to see your family often, if at all. Letters were rare luxuries for people who could write, postage wasn't cheap, and time wasn't plentiful. Goodbye didn't mean see you later. Goodbye meant you now belong somewhere else. When you arrived at your new household, the shift was immediate. You weren't treated like a guest. You were treated like someone with duties waiting, because you were. Apprentices had no adjustment period. You entered a world where adults expected you to follow rules you hadn't learned yet, perform tasks you didn't understand yet, and rise before dawn with the energy of someone entirely unfamiliar with the concept of fatigue. But amid the shock, something else happened. You adapted. Not gracefully, not instantly, but inevitably. The human soul in 1600s England had a remarkable talent for adjusting to whatever was placed before it. You learned the sounds of the new house, the rhythms of the workshop, the moods of the master, the hierarchy among fellow apprentices, the rules, spoken and unspoken, that governed your new life. The work varied depending on the trade. If you apprenticed to a blacksmith, you spent your early months sweeping floors, hauling coal, and wondering if heat could permanently melt your eyebrows. If you served a tailor, you learned to measure, cut, stitch, and ignore the aching in your fingers. If you joined a merchant, you ran errands, packed goods, memorized prices, and resisted the temptation to accidentally misplace anything expensive. Domestic apprenticeships for girls meant learning cooking, cleaning, child-minding, and the dozens of invisible tasks that made a household function. The early years of apprenticeship were less about mastering a trade and more about mastering obedience. You followed instructions, endured corrections, learned from harsh moments, and slowly earn trust. Masters were strict not out of cruelty, but because time was precious, resources were limited, and training a child required patience that daily survival sometimes did not afford. You made mistakes. They made sure you didn't make them twice. Your place in the household fell somewhere between family and servant. You weren't a child anymore, but you weren't fully a worker either. Masters might feed you well one day and reprimand you sharply the next. You earned praise rarely, responsibility gradually, and respect only after years of proving your reliability. Fellowship among apprentices became your emotional anchor. You bonded over shared exhaustion, whispered jokes, and the collective understanding that you were all living the same peculiar halfway life. Surprisingly, many apprenticeships offered genuine pride. Once you learned the basics of the craft, the work took on rhythm and purpose. You produced something, shoes, tools, cloth, bread, and saw your skills evolve. You contributed to the household. You gained competence, and competence tasted like independence. In a world where survival demanded ability, learning a trade was one of the few paths toward dignity. But the emotional cost was real. Homesickness wasn't a recognized condition, but that didn't make it less painful. You missed your siblings' laughter, your mother's voice, your familiar bed, even if it wasn't comfortable, and the sense of belonging that childhood offered. Apprentices didn't cry openly. They just worked harder, swallowed their feelings, and hoped time would numb the ache. Eventually it did. Apprenticeship lasted years, sometimes 7 or more, and by the end of it, you had become part of the household in a way you never anticipated. Then, just as quietly as you had left your family, you left your master's home too. With skills in hand and adulthood fully arrived, you stepped into the world as a craftsman, labourer, or servant ready to claim your place. Apprenticeship didn't just replace family, it remade you. It took the child your parents wrapped in patched clothing and returned an adult the world could use. A person shaped by distance, discipline, labour, and the strange, steady comfort of belonging somewhere new. In 1600s England, that was the path almost everyone walked. You left home young. Everyone did. Hunger in 1600s. England was not a dramatic event. It wasn't a sudden crisis or a tragic collapse at the dinner table. It was a familiar companion, a soft, persistent hum beneath everyday life. You didn't gasp with hunger. You didn't protest hunger. You lived alongside hunger the way modern people live alongside background music at the grocery store, constantly present, occasionally noticeable and entirely unavoidable. You weren't starving. You were waiting. Food shortages were not exceptions. They were part of the agricultural rhythm. Some years brought good harvests, some brought passable ones, and some delivered disasters that echoed in the stomachs of everyone in the region. A late frost, a summer drought, too much rain, too little rain, crop blight, failed barley, failed wheat. Anything could tilt the balance between enough to get by and let's hope next year is kinder. And even in the best years, food was not abundant. It was rationed, measured, stretched, and repurposed with an artistry that modern chefs might admire, if they weren't horrified by the ingredients. Nothing edible was wasted. Nothing nearly edible was wasted. Scraps became soups. Soups became stews. Stews became tomorrow's breakfast. And breakfast became the memory that sustained you until the next meal. Children learned early that hunger wasn't an emergency. It was the natural state between meals, and sometimes during meals. You understood that when adults said, "We'll eat soon," soon could mean an hour, a few hours, or whenever the bread finally finished baking. Your stomach adjusted its expectations accordingly, protesting only mildly, as if it too had accepted that complaining wouldn't change the supply. Seasonal hunger was its own version of weather. In summer, fresh produce trickled in from gardens, greens, herbs, the occasional berry if birds hadn't beaten you to them. But summer also demanded physical labour, and labour burned through whatever calories you consumed. Hunger in summer felt different, sharp, quick, and often ignored until evening. Autumn brought relief, the culmination of fields harvested and stored. It was the one moment the household felt wealthy, not wealthy in coin, but in sacks of grain, baskets of apples, and salted meats hung from rafters. Children tasted new bread again. Adults breathed easier. But the comfort was temporary. Everyone knew winter loomed, and winter was ruthless. Winter hunger moved slowly, deliberately, a kind of creeping emptiness that matched the season's darkness. Food stores dwindled, root vegetables softened, salted meat aged into toughness. Grain supplies dropped from sufficient to stretch it out to this is being rationed now. Meals grew thinner, soups grew clearer, and bowls felt lighter in your hands. Parents shielded children from the worst of it when possible, but shielding was limited by reality. You still felt the quiet ache, the persistent awareness that your stomach was not entirely satisfied. Yet hunger rarely inspired panic, because panic was impractical. Hunger was simply part of the season, like cold fingers or early sunsets. Lean years amplified the cycle. If crops failed, the entire community felt the collective tightening of belts. Grain prices rose, markets buzzed with worry. Bread became smaller and more expensive. Some families relied on charity that stretched thin across villages. Others gathered anything edible from hedgerows, nettles, sorrel, mushrooms if someone knew which ones wouldn't kill them. Children, too, adapted. You learned to savour meals not because they tasted wonderful, but because they existed. You ate slowly when food was scarce, quickly when you needed energy for labour, and gratefully when a rare treat, like cheese or a handful of dried fruit, appeared on your plate. You learned that fullness was a temporary luxury, not an expectation. Despite the omnipresent hunger, communal meals maintained structure and comfort. Families ate together, not to enjoy elaborate dishes, but to reaffirm that hunger was faced collectively. Eating was connection. Thin soups tasted stronger when shared. Bread felt softer when divided among familiar hands. Children observed these rituals, understanding intuitively that meals were less about flavour and more about unity. Festivals broke the monotony. Religious and agricultural celebrations brought feasts, modest, by modern standards but glorious compared to daily fare. Roast meats, pies, ale, occasionally even sweets appeared. These meals didn't erase hunger. They simply reminded you what life tasted like when hunger loosened its grip. Children remembered festival meals the way modern children remember holidays, not for the specifics, but for the rare feeling of abundance. Hunger also taught strategy. You learned how to stretch food, add water to stew, add oats to bread, add hope to everything. You learned how to appear content even when you weren't, because adults needed the reassurance. You learned to avoid raiding food stores, not just because it was wrong, but because you had witnessed the consequences of trying. Hunger shaped your self-control before you even understood the concept. Even so, children whispered about food constantly. Favourite meals, remembered meals, imagined meals. Playtime sometimes included pretend feasts, elaborate spreads conjured from dirt and leaves. You hosted invisible banquets fit for kings, because imagination cost nothing and filled a different kind of emptiness. And in all of this, hunger quietly shaped your worldview. You grew up understanding scarcity, not abundance. You learned the fragility of good years, the uncertainty of seasons, the importance of sharing, and the dangers of waste. Hunger wasn't the villain of your childhood. It was the narrator, calm, steady, and undeniably present. So no, you weren't starving. That would have required more drama. You were waiting for the next meal, the next season, the next harvest, the next moment when hunger eased just enough for your body to relax. And in 1600s England, waiting was a skill every child mastered long before adulthood arrived. Illness in 1600s. England wasn't an interruption of life. It was life. It drifted into your home the same way cold air seeped through the walls, quietly, constantly, and without anyone asking permission. You learned the names of sicknesses early: ague, flux, consumption, quinsy, pox. But learning their cures? That was wishful thinking. You learned names for sickness, not cures. Disease followed you from infancy, weaving itself into your days with an ease that made it almost mundane. A child's cough didn't inspire panic. A fever didn't automatically summon alarm. They were simply added to the week's list of inconveniences, somewhere between fetch more water and mend the torn sleeve. Only when symptoms worsened did adults look at each other with the expression that meant this might be serious. And even then, serious had a wide range of meanings. Child mortality loomed large in every family's memory. Almost everyone knew a child who had died, often several. Families carried grief the way they carried firewood, heavily, constantly, and without talking about it more than necessary. Death didn't arrive as a shocking visitor. It existed in the background, familiar as a neighbour, and just as unpredictable. The roots of this grim reality were everywhere. Homes were drafty, crowded, and far from sterile. Water sources were unreliable. Food could spoil. Winters were brutal. Summers carried their own diseases. Livestock shared living spaces. Insects thrived. Parasites circulated like uninvited dinner guests. And medical knowledge? Medical knowledge hovered somewhere between hopeful guessing and dramatic improvisation. Doctors existed, but seeing one required money. More money than many families could justify spending unless a situation reached the upper end of terrifying. Even then, the doctor's arrival didn't guarantee improvement. Many physicians relied on theories of humours, astrology, or outdated scholarly principles inherited from ancient texts. They believed disease came from imbalanced bodily fluids or bad air. Their treatments included bloodletting, purging, sweating, or administering concoctions whose main ingredient was, let's hope this helps. Most families relied instead on midwives, wise women, neighbours, or household remedies passed down through generations. Remedies included herbs, teas, poultices, and tonics, some helpful, some harmless, some actively regrettable. A sore throat might earn you a warm posset or a honey mixture. A fever might mean wrapping you in layers until you sweated out the poison, leaving you hotter, crankier, and no closer to recovery. A persistent cough might be treated with herbs boiled in ale, which you drank even if the combination tasted like regret. Children learned to accept these remedies with stoic resignation. Adults gave them confidently, because they believed confidence was half the cure. But confidence didn't prevent diseases from running their course. Illness came often, it lingered. It passed unevenly through households, sparing some children while striking others down with brutal efficiency. In this world, the boundary between sickness and normal life blurred. Many children lived with chronic ailments, persistent coughs, stiff joints, lingering fevers that modern medicine would diagnose and treat. But in the 1600s, these symptoms were simply woven into your existence. You might cough all winter and be declared healthy enough. You might limp slightly and be told you'd grow out of it. You might feel weak after an illness and be urged to help gather firewood anyway, because work didn't pause for frailty. Epidemics introduced sharper fear but followed the same acceptance. Smallpox, measles, plague, and influenza swept through towns and villages with little opposition. When an outbreak hit, families braced themselves. They prayed. They isolated if possible, though true isolation in crowded homes was nearly impossible, and they waited. That was all anyone could do. Wait and hope the sickness passed by your doorstep. Children absorbed this atmosphere with unsettling ease. You learned early that death was not reserved for the old. It could claim an older sibling, a friend, a neighbour, or even a parent. You grew familiar with funeral rites, sombre gatherings held quickly, sometimes within a day, because bodies could not be kept long. You learned to mourn in a quiet, practical way, mirroring adults who had learned long ago that grief never stopped life from demanding more work the next morning. But amid the harshness, families still cared for one another with tenderness. When you fell ill, adults brought warm blankets, whispered prayers, and sat beside your bed even when they believed the illness might take you. Siblings fetched water, fed you broth, and hovered nearby with the anxious intensity of children who knew too much about loss. Love was present, steady, unspoken, shaped by the knowledge that each moment mattered, and sometimes, miraculously, you recovered. You survived the fevers, the coughing fits, the aches, the frightening nights when adults watched your chest rise and fall with dread. Recovery brought relief not expressed through tears or celebration, but through the quiet return of routine. Adults believed gratitude was best shown by resuming life, and children learned to follow suit. Illness didn't define your childhood. It threaded through it, weaving resilience into your bones far earlier than should be necessary. You learned to endure discomfort, to accept uncertainty, and to find joy even in fragile seasons. You didn't fear every sickness. You expected some of them, survived many of them, and lived with the understanding that health was temporary but life persisted anyway. Death, too, became less an end than a familiar presence. You didn't grow hardened. You grew realistic. The line between living and dying felt thin but navigable, and children like you walked it with a seriousness far beyond your years. So no, you didn't grow up learning cures. You learned stories about illnesses, tales of who survived and who didn't, and a quiet philosophy of acceptance, that sickness came, sickness went, and life continued in the spaces between. This was childhood in 1600s England, fragile, resilient, and shaped by forces no one understood but everyone endured. Cleanliness in 1600s England operated on a scale very different from modern expectations. A bath wasn't a daily routine. It wasn't even a weekly routine. It was a logistical event, a family negotiation, and occasionally a public spectacle. You weren't dirty. You were historically appropriate. Let's begin with the bath itself. An unwieldy wooden tub that lived in a corner of the house or outbuilding and required several hours of water-hauling, heating and managing. Heating enough water for a single bath took so much fuel and labour that many households simply didn't bother unless it was absolutely necessary. And absolutely necessary usually meant someone smelled so powerfully that even 17th century noses, which had built-in tolerance, surrendered. Instead of full baths, people practiced what could charitably be called strategic washing. You scrubbed your face, hands, neck, and maybe feet. These areas had the highest social visibility, and social visibility mattered far more than actual hygiene. A clean face meant respectability. Clean hands meant you weren't a complete barbarian. Clean clothes, optional but appreciated. Clean body, bonus. Soap existed, but it was harsh, expensive, and often used more for laundry than skin. Washing clothes took serious effort and a good stretch of dry weather, so garments were worn until they reached the threshold where their odour could no longer be explained as the smell of honest labour. When garments needed freshening, people often hung them outdoors to air out, because the wind was the cheapest made available. There were, of course, myths surrounding bathing. Some people believed immersing the body in hot water opened the pores to illness, making you vulnerable to bad air, which was thought to carry disease. Others insisted that washing too frequently weakened the body. A few believed bathhouses were dens of immorality, especially after plague outbreaks painted them as sources of infection. Between fear, inconvenience, and cultural belief, bathing simply didn't rise to the level of priority. The result? A general population that maintained its hygiene through minimal effort, a lot of linen, and unwavering optimism. Linen, in fact, was the real hero of personal cleanliness. People wore linen shirts or shifts under their outer clothing because linen absorbed sweat and could be washed more frequently than heavy wool garments. Changing your linen counted as getting clean. A fresh shirt meant you were essentially reborn. Your body might be the same as yesterday, but your underlayer was crisp, and that meant something. And then there was the omnipresent issue of lice, small, stubborn tenants who treated every household like prime real estate. Children and adults alike dealt with lice, nits, and fleas as routinely as modern people deal with notifications on their phones. No one liked them, but no one was surprised by them either. Lice combs were common tools. Hair washing happened infrequently, so delousing sessions became part of family maintenance, like mending clothing or storing grain. Fleas were even more democratic. They lived in bedding, cracks in furniture, animal fur, straw mattresses and clothing fibres. You could spend an evening thoroughly scratching only to wake up peppered with new bites. Entire communities scratched in harmony. Complaining about fleas didn't solve anything. It simply reminded everyone else that they were itchy too. Even so, there was an etiquette to hygiene. Smelling too strong was a social faux pas, even in a society where odours were ambient. Sweat from honest work? Acceptable. Rancid odour from neglect? Not so acceptable. The line between the two varied by community, but everyone recognised it. Children learned early to wash, at least the visible parts of themselves, especially before church or market days, when presentation mattered. Teeth received their own unconventional grooming. Toothbrushes existed but were expensive. Most children used small linen cloths, wooden sticks chewed into bristles, or simply rinsed their mouths with herbal infusions. Sugar consumption was limited for ordinary families, which helped with dental survival. But toothache was still a common torment, one often treated with prayers, herbs, or holding warm cloths against your cheek while trying not to think about extraction, a word that made even adults whisper. Hygiene was deeply connected to effort. The more work involved in cleaning something, the less often it was done. Hair washing required water, buckets, firewood and time, so hair was brushed, braided or tied up to hide both oil and unwanted inhabitants. Bathing required planning, heating, hauling, drying and airing, and therefore happened rarely. Cleaning a house required non-stop sweeping because dirt, soot and animal debris drifted inside daily. No one could keep up with everything at all times. People prioritised survival and let aesthetics follow at a dignified distance. Children in this world didn't perceive themselves as dirty. Dirt was simply part of existence, a badge of outdoor exploration, chores and labour. Adults scolded children when filth became excessive, but excessive was a sliding scale measured mostly by whether dirt interfered with tasks or embarrassed the family and public. And yet, despite the scarcity of water-heavy cleaning, people weren't entirely graceless. They valued freshness where it mattered. They used herbs, oils, and pleasant scents to mask odours: lavender, rosemary, sweet woodruff. Homes might not have gleamed, but they smelled like someone tried, which was often enough. Ultimately, 1600s hygiene was shaped by practical limitations, cultural beliefs, and the ever-present balance between comfort and effort. If washing required half a day of work and staying slightly dirty required none, people chose the reasonable path. You weren't filthy, you weren't negligent, you weren't uncivilized, you were historically appropriate. And in a world where life demanded constant energy, good enough cleanliness was not only acceptable, it was sensible, sustainable, and surprisingly effective for the time. Affection in 1600s, England did not arrive wrapped in soft words or warm hugs. It arrived disguised as authority, discipline, and the kind of instructions that brooked no argument. Adults were not gentle, not because they didn't care, but because gentleness was a luxury few families believed they could afford. Love was implied, instructions were clear. To understand why adults behaved this way, you must imagine a world where survival loomed over every decision. Food could run short, illness could arrive overnight, accidents could destroy a household's stability in seconds. In this environment, parents weren't simply caretakers, they were strategists fighting time, circumstance and misfortune. Children weren't raised to flourish emotionally, they were raised to endure. Softness didn't disappear, it simply hid itself under layers of practicality. When adults spoke, their tone carried authority like a built-in drumbeat. Commands were direct, concise, and sometimes sharp enough to slice through debate. Bring water, close the door, mind the fire, watch the baby. These weren't suggestions, They were instructions delivered with the expectation of immediate action. Children didn't ask why, because the answer, some combination of danger, necessity, or adult exhaustion, was obvious. This did not mean adults lacked affection. They expressed love through vigilance, by ensuring you wore enough layers in winter, by giving you extra bread when you looked pale, by repositioning you closer to the fire at night, by pulling you away from hazards before you even noticed them. Affection was survival, and survival required speed, decisiveness, and very little softness. Emotional distance also stemmed from grief. Families lived with the constant shadow of loss, and parents learned, consciously or not, to guard their hearts by keeping attachment practical. They loved fiercely, but outward displays were cautious, as if visible tenderness might tempt fate. Instead of saying, "I love you," they said, "Eat, come inside," or "Don't wander too far." These phrases were less poetic, but in 1600s England they were declarations of care. Complex emotions were rarely discussed. Adults assumed children would learn resilience by experiencing hardship, not talking about it. Tears were tolerated briefly, then redirected into chores, lessons, or prayer. "You're fine, be strong, and it will pass," were the era's emotional toolkits. Adults believed strength came from endurance, not expression, and children adapted to this expectation with the same instinct that helped them adapt to hunger, cold, and responsibility. Authority wasn't just a family structure, it was a cultural atmosphere. Society itself reinforced a rigid hierarchy. God over the world, king over subjects, master over apprentice, parent over child. This hierarchy trickled down into daily life. Adults didn't negotiate with children. They guided, guarded, and corrected. They believed their authority was not only natural but necessary. Without it, children might make dangerous choices, wander near the river, mishandle fire, upset livestock, eat something poisonous. Authority protected everyone by narrowing a child's freedom to a manageable, survivable range. Affection, when it surfaced, was subtle. A parent might sit beside you while you were sick, keeping the fire warm and your forehead cool. They wouldn't gush over you, but they would remain awake through long nights listening for changes in your breathing. A mother might adjust your clothing before church, tugging your collar straight with a swift practiced gesture. A father might carve you a small toy from leftover wood, but hand it to you without ceremony, pretending it was nothing. This was love, just written in a different script. Children didn't interpret the emotional distance as cruelty. They interpreted it as normal. Adults were figures of authority, steady, strict, protective, sometimes intimidating, occasionally teasing, rarely tender. Their affection slipped through sideways, a softened tone after a hard day, a shared smile when something amusing happened, a piece of food quietly saved for you, a story told in the dim evening light. Households, even strict ones, still had warmth. Laughter occurred, though often softly. Stories passed down through generations. Siblings played together in moments stolen from chores. Adults exchanged dry humour, practical jokes, and occasional teasing that lightened the weight of daily life. Emotional expression wasn't absent. It was simply rationed, like everything else. Apprenticeship and service further cemented this emotional culture. When children left home, they entered households where affection was even more subtle. Masters rarely praised, mistresses rarely soothed. Earned approval came in the form of new responsibilities or slightly less severe reprimands. Apprentices learned to interpret these signals as emotional currency, unspoken recognition of their growing competence. The church reinforced emotional restraint as well. Sermons emphasized humility, obedience, and the dangers of excessive self-indulgence. Expressing too much joy was considered frivolous. Expressing too much sorrow verged on sinful doubt. Control was a virtue. Stillness was strength. And children absorbed these lessons deeply. But beneath this exterior, adult affection never disappeared. It manifested in endurance, parents working late into the evening so their children had enough to eat, mothers rising early to prepare the day's food, fathers repairing shoes, tools, or roof so the family stayed dry and warm. Love was action, not sentiment. Safety, not softness. Children recognized this, even if they didn't have words for it. They learned to feel loved through gestures rather than language. A bowl served first, a blanket tucked tightly, a gentle hand on the shoulder after a frightening moment. These were milestones of care far more meaningful than spoken affection. So yes, adults were not gentle by modern standards. Their voices were sharp, their expectations high, their corrections swift. But the structure they created, however stern, was built from devotion. Love didn't sit in the open. Love stood watch. And in 1600s England, that was the gentlest gift anyone could offer. Fear in 1600s. England wasn't an emotional accident. It was a curriculum. Children learned caution, morality, and obedience, not just through rules or discipline, but through stories. Dark, vivid, lingering stories that shaped the nighttime as firmly as fire shaped the daylight. Nighttime wasn't peaceful. It was instructional. The world around you was full of unknowns, and adults filled those unknowns with meaning, warnings, and consequences. They taught you that danger existed in places you couldn't see, that invisible forces watched your actions, and that the boundary between the natural and supernatural was a thin curtain that fluttered easily in the wind. Fear wasn't cruelty. Fear was preventative education. Ghost stories were often your first lessons in boundaries. Adults used them the way modern parents use fences. Instead of saying, "Don't wander into the woods," they said, "Children who go into the woods hear voices calling them by name, and sometimes the voices don't belong to anyone living." Instead of "Stay inside after dark," you heard, "Spirits walk at dusk looking for company." Practical, advice delivered with supernatural flair. These stories weren't told around campfires for fun. They were told in dim cottages, by tired adults who needed children to behave, stay close, and avoid danger without requiring constant supervision. Ghosts were the unpaid babysitters of the century. You learned that crossroads were haunted, abandoned houses were cursed, and moors carried the voices of the lost. Streams had sprites, forests had wandering spirits, and old wells had eyes. If something unexplained happened, a creaking board, a sudden cold breeze, a misplaced object, the explanation was simple. The unseen world was reminding you of its presence. Fear shaped your nights long before you understood its logic. Shadows stretched across the floor like reaching arms. The wind through thatched roofs sounded like whispering. Animals moving outside mimicked footsteps. Night was full of movement, and while adults assured you it was nothing, they also told enough cautionary tales to make nothing feel extremely alive. But supernatural stories were only one form of instructional fear. The church layered a second one, hellfire. Ministers preached with urgency, describing eternal punishment with such vivid detail that children sat frozen on benches, absorbing every word like sponges dipped in apprehension. You heard about flames, demons, torment, and the narrow path of righteousness. You learned that sin was everywhere, temptation was constant, and God's judgment was both merciful and terrifying. Adults believed these lessons would instill moral discipline, and they did. Children monitored themselves with impressive vigilance. A stray thought could cause panic. A small lie could lead to hours of internal debate. You learned early that salvation required perpetual alertness, like living with a divine supervisor who reviewed your every decision. If ghost stories kept you physically safe, hellfire kept you spiritually aligned. And then, woven between folklore and religion, lived the realm of superstition, an entire worldview built on signs, omens, and rituals. Superstition wasn't fringe. It was everyday wisdom, passed along with the same seriousness as household advice. You learned not to step on certain thresholds, not to leave shoes upside down, and not to whistle after dark. You avoided certain trees, offered respect to ancient stones, and made the sign of the cross when hearing unexplained noises. A chimney puffing smoke the wrong way meant bad luck. A broken pot foretold an argument. A bird tapping the window meant either news or death, depending on which adult was interpreting. Children grew up navigating this maze of symbolic meaning, not questioning its logic, but absorbing it as part of the landscape. You kept track of which actions drew luck and which invited misfortune. You learned to toss spilled salt, tie protective charms, and never mention certain creatures by name after sunset. Superstition served a purpose. Beyond fear, they provided structure in a world full of uncertainty. When sickness struck, crops failed, or storms destroyed roofs, people needed explanations. Science wasn't widely understood, so stories stepped in. They didn't solve problems, but they offered meaning, and children found comfort in rules that made the unpredictable feel governable. Still, fear had practical benefits. It kept you away from dangerous places, deep water, steep cliffs, unstable buildings, unfamiliar forests. It taught you that actions had consequences, sometimes cosmic ones. It encouraged humility, caution, and attentiveness, and it made you listen to adults even when you didn't want to. Nighttime routines reflected this atmosphere. Before bed, you checked the shutters, not because you feared intruders, but because you feared what might slip in uninvited. You avoided staring too long into dark corners. You hurried from one room to another with the speed of someone who knew better than to linger. Bedtime wasn't a gentle winding down. It was a retreat into layers of blankets, seeking warmth and security, while the world outside hummed with imagined activity. But fear didn't control you entirely. Children adapted to it, learned to laugh at certain stories, and whispered exaggerated versions to each other for entertainment. Moonlight softened the edges of terror. Familiar routines dimmed superstition's power, and occasionally bravery surged, enough to walk alone to the well or stare boldly at a shadow until it revealed itself as a coat. Fear educated you, but it also sharpened you. It taught you to observe, interpret, and react. You developed a sense of caution that adults trusted, because they had raised you on tales that made recklessness feel like tempting fate. In this way, fear became a companion rather than an enemy. It shaped your understanding of danger and morality. It guided your steps, tuned your senses, and gave meaning to the unknown. Nighttime wasn't peaceful. It was instructional. And in 1600s England, that instruction stayed with you long after the candles burned out. Growing up in 1600s England meant growing up visible. Not metaphorically, literally visible. Every step you took, every chore you attempted, every mistake you made, every moment you hoped would fade quietly into the background, was observed, noted, remembered, and occasionally shared with alarming enthusiasm. Everyone knew you, even when you wished they didn't. Villages were small, tightly woven networks where households clustered around fields, wells, churches, and common spaces. Privacy was not an expectation. It was a fantasy. Doors were thin, walls were thinner, and voices carried beautifully across open lanes. Children didn't belong solely to their parents. They belonged to the community, and that meant the entire community felt both entitled and obligated to monitor, correct, and sometimes meddle. Your life unfolded under a constant soft surveillance. That wasn't malicious. It was simply how survival worked. Communities depended on cooperation and mutual awareness. People needed to know who was reliable, who needed help, who owed a favour, and who had a habit of wandering dangerously close to the neighbour's goose enclosure. A mistake you only made once, maybe twice. From the moment you could toddle, the village watched you with a kind of shared custodianship. If your mother sent you to fetch water, a neighbour would call out a reminder to hold the bucket properly. If you slipped and spilled it, someone else would remark, loudly, about how that happened last week too. You could not make a mistake quietly. Mistakes belonged to the entire village. This communal attention came with benefits. If you wandered too far, someone guided you back. If you tripped, a hand lifted you. If you forgot your errand, 3 adults repeated it for you with the clarity of people who took pride in never forgetting anything you did. Helpfulness and commentary were inseparable. Gossip was the village's preferred communication method. Information moved through town with the agility of smoke, drifting into every household, warming some hearts and singeing others. Children grew up understanding that secrets were fragile, not because they didn't exist, but because they rarely survived more than a few hours. If you dropped a jug, the village knew before the shard stopped bouncing. If you spoke rudely to an elder, half the town replayed your exact phrasing by sundown. If you accidentally stepped into a puddle so deep you emerged looking like an escaped swamp creature, people remembered it fondly for years. Even infants weren't exempt. Adults recalled who had cried the loudest as a baby, or who toddled with the wobble of someone learning balancing skills from unsteady livestock. This constant visibility shaped your behaviour. You learned to walk properly on the road because everyone was watching. You learned not to throw stones toward the neighbour's garden because people would talk about it. You learned to greet adults respectfully, not because your parents alone insisted, but because ignoring a villager guaranteed that they, and their 3 closest friends, would bring it up the next time they saw your mother. And yet, this public accountability came with a strange comfort. You were never alone. Community meant security. Children walked to the well or fields knowing that someone, often many someones, would keep an eye on them. If danger appeared, if illness struck, if a household struggled, villagers stepped in with food, labour or companionship. You learned early that survival wasn't individual, it was collective. Village gatherings reinforced this sense of shared life. Market days brought activity and noise, a swirl of conversation in which everyone's business, recent, past or hypothetical, was inevitably reviewed. Festivals invited laughter, dancing and storytelling, during which adults remembered your childhood blunders with the theatrical flair of seasoned performers. "Do you recall the time?" someone would begin, and you would brace yourself for a tale you hoped had faded into obscurity. Church intensified the communal gaze. The entire village gathered weekly, dressed in their cleanest linen and their sternest expressions. Children sat beneath the watchful eyes of not only their parents, but also neighbours who considered it their personal responsibility to maintain order. If you fidgeted, someone behind you tapped your shoulder. If you whispered, someone beside you cleared their throat with a sharpness designed to terrify. You grew up understanding that your reputation existed long before you contributed anything to earn it. Adults described you to others with phrases like a lively child, a quiet one, or the one who climbs everything. These labels stuck to you like burrs to wool. Changing them took effort, more effort than simply avoiding the behaviours that caused them in the first place. Even within your home, community presence lingered. Neighbours entered without knocking. Elders offered unsolicited advice about your posture, your manners, your work pace, and occasionally your entire personality. If your mother mentioned you were acting up, at least 3 people volunteered stories about how they raised their children, and one person claimed their child had never once misbehaved. This was a lie, but it was a culturally accepted lie. When conflict erupted between families, children felt the ripples instantly. Whose cow damaged whose vegetables? Who borrowed a tool and returned it dull? Who owed bread or eggs or favours? These disputes became part of the background noise of community life, and children absorbed the rules of diplomacy by listening, watching, and occasionally being sent as neutral messengers. But living in constant visibility also taught resilience. You learned to laugh at embarrassment because everyone else already was. You learned to accept correction because resistance was futile and would be witnessed by at least 4 people. You learned to rely on others, trust others, and be trusted in return. Community life shaped you into a person who understood that independence and interdependence were not opposites but partners. In 1600s England, childhood wasn't a private journey. It was a public project. Everyone raised you. Everyone watched you. Everyone remembered you, even when you wished they didn't. In 1600s England, the law did not see children as whimsical bundles of potential. It saw them as people, smaller, yes, but fully capable of causing trouble, damage, inconvenience, and moral chaos. And because the law concerned itself with trouble, damage, and chaos, childhood did not grant immunity. You weren't innocent. You were small. Legally speaking, childhood had firm edges and soft protections. At age 7, a number chosen by tradition, theology, and an optimistic sense of human development, you were considered capable of moral judgment. 7 was the age the law decided you could distinguish right from wrong. Whether you actually could was irrelevant. Once you reached 7, your actions acquired legal consequences, although usually lighter than those applied to adults. Before 7, excuses could be made. After 7, explanations were expected. This meant children were held accountable for theft, property damage, public disorder, and any number of imaginative misdeeds villages believed only children could invent. If you stole apples from an orchard, you could be punished. If you damaged tools, you could be punished. If you mocked an elder loudly enough to disrupt public peace, you could definitely be punished. The law didn't need you to understand the intricacies of legality. It needed you to understand that actions had consequences, and those consequences could appear swiftly. Punishments varied depending on the severity of the offence and the temperament of the local authorities. Some villages handled minor misbehaviour through community scolding, delivered with all the gravity of a public ceremony and all the subtlety of a thunderclap. If the entire village knew your name, it wasn't because you were famous. It was because you had been caught doing something memorable. For small offences, children might receive warnings or verbal reprimands, often accompanied by a symbolic punishment, a brief confinement, a small fine paid by the family, or an unpleasant chore. But these reprimands were never gentle. Authority spoke loudly so the lesson could be heard clearly and repeated later to anyone who hadn't been present. More serious misbehaviour brought harsher penalties. A common punishment for minors was whipping, often carried out in a public place where witnesses ensured you learned the proper combination of shame and pain. Adults believed this was effective education. Children believed this was extremely unfair, but no, one asked for their opinion. Temporary confinement could also occur. Children might be locked briefly in a small room, a shed, or another discreet enclosure that adults swore wasn't cruel. It was corrective isolation. To a child, it was a dark box with questionable smells, and you promised yourself never to steal a chicken again. At least not that chicken. If the offence involved property, restitution was expected. Families paid fines or compensated victims through labour, food, or goods. This reinforced an important lesson. Your mistakes affected everyone in the household. If you committed the crime, your mother might lose her only decent cooking pot to pay the fine. If that wasn't motivation to behave, nothing was. Despite their sternness, communities rarely treated children as criminals in the modern sense. The purpose of punishment was correction, not condemnation. Adults believed strongly in moral reform. They simply approached it with the same intensity they brought to every other aspect of survival. A child capable of mischief was also capable of improvement, preferably delivered through abrupt, memorable teaching moments. Still, children weren't immune to larger legal systems. If you committed a serious crime, arson, violent assault, or repeated theft, you could be brought before magistrates. Trials were brief. Judges asked questions designed to determine guilt swiftly. Children were expected to answer clearly, respectfully, and truthfully. Lying in court was its own offence, and even small children understood that courts were not places where cleverness paid off. Punishments for child offenders in formal courts varied widely. Some received admonishment and released to their families. Others were sentenced to labour in workhouses or forced service under supervision. The harshest penalties, imprisonment or execution, were rare for minors but not impossible. The law recognized youth but did not consider it a shield. Even outside formal legal structures, children encountered everyday rules enforced through local authority. Constables kept order with firm hands, village elders intervened with stern lectures, and church wardens monitored public behaviour with vigilance. A child caught misbehaving inside the churchyard risked both spiritual and civic correction. Reverence was not optional. But the presence of law in childhood served more than punitive purposes. It taught children how society functioned. You learned what was allowed and what was forbidden. You learned which actions harmed the community. You learned that reputation mattered, that trust was fragile, and that adults observed everything with the accuracy of hawks and the memory of bards. Interestingly, this legal vigilance created strong boundaries as well as strong support. Children who obeyed the rules were praised, protected, and guided. Communities rallied around children who behaved responsibly. The same adults who scolded you for a small offence would defend you fiercely if someone else treated you unjustly. Law and love in this era operated side by side. Growing up under this structure taught you the weight of responsibility early. You didn't imagine a world where you could behave recklessly without repercussions. You understood that your choices echoed beyond your small frame, affecting your family and community. This awareness shaped you into an adult long before your body completed the task. Childhood had limits. You weren't innocent. You were small. And in 1600s England, the law made sure you never forgot it. In 1600s England, emotions were not something you unpacked. They were something you endured. Children didn't grow up learning vocabulary for their feelings or strategies for self-care. Therapy did not exist. Reflection was considered suspiciously close to idleness and vulnerability. That was a luxury for people with spare time, which excluded almost everyone. You didn't process feelings, you continued. Mental and emotional life unfolded beneath the surface, unspoken and unexamined. Families loved each other deeply, worried constantly, grieved frequently, but they rarely articulated these states. Life demanded movement, work, and resilience. Emotions were acknowledged only to the extent that they interfered with those requirements. If you cried too long, someone eventually said, "Enough," and handed you something practical to do. If you were frightened, the solution was a stern reassurance followed by the expectation you return to your task. Emotional expression existed, but only in brief functional bursts. Children learned quickly that feelings needed containment. If you scraped your knee, adults checked for real injury. If none was found, the emotional aftermath was considered optional. Tears were allowed for approximately the amount of time it took an adult to decide they'd had enough. After that, crying became an inconvenience, and inconveniences earned firm reminders that the world was not made of softness. Grief occupied a peculiar place in this culture. Death, as you had already learned in earlier chapters of your life, visited often, unpredictably, and with little ceremony. Families lost children, parents, siblings, and neighbours with painful frequency. Yet grief was rarely accompanied by open lamentation. People mourned by continuing their routines, feeding animals, gathering water, tending fields, because survival allowed no pause. Children absorbed this lesson intimately. When someone died, the household moved quietly but steadily through the required rituals, preparing the body, attending the funeral, offering prayers. Adults spoke softly, faces lined with sorrow, but bones still moving purposefully. You understood that sadness existed, but you also understood that sadness must not disrupt the fragile machinery of daily life. The world did not stop when a heart broke. The world barely slowed. This didn't mean 1600s families lacked love or emotional depth. It meant they expressed it differently. Love appeared in the form of extra bread when you looked weary, or a blanket draped silently across your shoulders at night. Grief appeared as a long exhale before someone resumed their work. Worry appeared in tighter supervision, not tender conversations. Care lived in gestures, not explanations. Fear, too, was managed rather than explored. If you were frightened by a story, a sound, or a memory, adults didn't sit beside you to unpack your anxieties. They offered firm assurance that you were safe, then encouraged you to stop dwelling on it. Dwelling, according to universal 1600s parenting logic, was dangerous because it distracted from responsibilities and weakened resolve. Resilience was the goal, not emotional insight. Mental health, as we understand it today, had no vocabulary. People spoke of melancholy, madness, spirits, or troubles of the mind. But these concepts blurred together in superstition, moral judgment, and rudimentary attempts at explanation. If someone suffered deep sadness, the community might encourage prayer, fresh air, labour, or herbal remedies. If someone acted unpredictably, they might be seen as spiritually afflicted or morally compromised. Children growing up in this environment learned to hide or compress their emotional struggles, knowing that adults interpreted strong feelings through a lens of discipline, not empathy. Daily life reinforced emotional restraint through expectations of endurance. Work didn't pause for your mood. Hunger didn't negotiate with your feelings. The weather didn't care if you were tired. And adults certainly didn't rearrange tasks because you woke up grumpy. Children followed the emotional example set before them. Steady, silent persistence. Still, emotional undercurrents shaped relationships in subtle ways. Siblings became confidants, sharing quiet conversations in lofts or behind barns where adult ears couldn't reach. These exchanges rarely involved eloquent self-analysis, but they created space for shared fear, frustration, or dreams. Children didn't articulate their emotions fully, but they recognized them in others. A sibling's tears softened your own hardness. A friend's laughter broke through fatigue. Emotional awareness developed quietly in stolen moments. Play, despite its scarcity, gave children the freedom to express emotions indirectly. Pretending to be heroes, villains, animals, or spirits allowed you to explore bravery, mischief, or imagination. Without crossing emotional lines adults considered inappropriate. Games served as miniature emotional outlets, small windows where children could be loud, silly, dramatic, or bold without consequence. Religion shaped emotional expression too. Joy was acceptable during festivals or hymns. Gratitude was required during prayer. Sorrow was permitted in church, but contained within ritual. The act of kneeling, singing, or repeating verses offered communal outlets for emotions that otherwise lacked form. But personal confession of grief, fear, loneliness remained rare. Even in courtship rituals, a life stage still distant for you at this chapter, emotional restraint was the rule. Affection was demonstrated through duty, labour, and steadiness, not words. In 1600s culture, the highest form of emotional sincerity was reliability. Children learned, through long observation, that endurance was both emotional and physical. You learned to comfort yourself by repeating tasks, singing quietly while working, or staring into the hearth while sorting your thoughts. These small rituals became your coping mechanisms, the closest things to emotional processing the era allowed. But despite the absence of formal emotional support, children were not emotionally barren. They felt deeply, they cared intensely, they formed attachments, mourned losses, celebrated joys, and longed for comfort. They simply lived in a world where continuing mattered more than understanding. So you adapted. You learned to carry your feelings lightly, like tools tucked into an apron pocket. You learned to keep moving even when sadness hung heavy. You learned to read love through actions and trust through consistency. And you learned that emotions, in this world, were not destinations. They were companions. You didn't process feelings. You continued. Growing up in 1600s, England meant growing up inside a social map you did not draw and absolutely could not redraw. Class wasn't simply a category. It was the architecture of your world, the invisible framework shaping every encounter, opportunity, and dream you ever dared to entertain. From childhood onward, you learned exactly where you stood. Ambition existed. Permission didn't. Class revealed itself early, long before anyone explained it to you. It appeared in the thickness of your bread, the weight of your chores, the stitching on your clothing, and the distance your parents kept from people of higher status. Children paid careful attention to tone, how adults addressed different people with different voices. Respect flowed upward. Familiarity flowed sideways. Downward flowed instruction. If you belonged to a poor or working family, which most children did, your world was built on labour and expectation. You knew your household survived through physical work, farming, weaving, smithing, brewing, or the endless list of trades that kept villages functioning. Your parents worked hard, your siblings worked hard, and one day you would work hard too. There was no resentment in this understanding. It was simply the shape of life. What you did notice, however, was how people treated each other differently based on rank. A landowner riding past a field did not greet the workers inside it. Workers paused their tasks anyway. Servants lowered their eyes when the gentry entered the room. The gentry did not return the gesture. Everyone understood the choreography and everyone performed it without needing direction. Children learned their place through these daily performances long before anyone clarified the rules. You watched how your mother spoke to a wealthier neighbour with a careful politeness she never used at home. You noticed your father remove his hat when addressing the local magistrate. You noticed that when important visitors arrived, children became background scenery, seen, silent, helpful if summoned, invisible if not. This wasn't humiliation. It was cultural survival. Class boundaries taught you how far your voice could travel. If you were a labourer's child, you didn't speak freely to the lord of the manor. If you were a servant's child, you didn't question the household's decisions. If you met someone from a significantly higher class, you adjusted your posture, softened your tone, and made yourself smaller in the way social norms required. Not because you feared punishment, though sometimes you did, but because stepping outside these norms felt like stepping into a story that wasn't yours. Class also shaped your future long before you reached it. Children internalized the paths laid out for them. A blacksmith's son would become a blacksmith or labourer. A farmer's daughter would become a farmer's wife, a servant, or a spinster living with relatives. Ambition was not absent. Children dreamed of better lives. But those dreams rarely challenged the system. Dreams stretched upward only as far as plausibility allowed. A farmer's child might long to own a slightly larger plot of land someday. A servant might hope to become a housekeeper or steward. Aspirations weren't extinguished. They were trained to stay within acceptable boundaries. If you were born into a higher class, the rules had a different texture but the same rigidity. Gentry children weren't free to choose their futures either. Their lives were shaped by obligations, inheritance, property management, political alliances, and marriages arranged to preserve status. A noble child might have more clothing, more books, and more food, but they also had more eyes on them. Every gesture, every failure, every moment of insolence carried heavier consequence, and regardless of class, marriage was one of the clearest demonstrations of these boundaries. You would marry someone of your own rank or slightly above if fortune smiled. Marrying far above your class was such a rare and dramatic event that entire communities would whisper about it for months. It happened in stories far more often than in reality, and even in stories it usually ended in disaster. Children learned early that love was delightful, but property law was decisive. Class shaped where you sat in church, literally. Wealthier families sat closer to the front. Poorer families occupied the back or the sides. This wasn't done to shame you. It was simply another accepted arrangement. Children observed these patterns and understood that spiritual equality did not translate into seating equality. In village life, class influenced how disputes were settled. If a wealthy person wronged you, justice moved slowly. If you wronged a wealthy person, justice moved at remarkable speed. Children saw this and learned discretion with the intuition of survivalists. Even language revealed rank. Accents differed by region and class. Vocabulary changed depending on who you spoke to. You instinctively switched tones when addressing different people, long before you understood why. And yet, despite all these boundaries, childhood still found ways to cross them. Children played across class lines more freely than adults did, at least in rural areas where proximity blurred distinctions. A landowner's child might race through fields with tenant children, all of you breathless, muddy, and temporarily blind to hierarchy. But when an adult appeared, the structure snapped back into place. Play ended. Roles resumed, and everyone remembered where they belonged. While children sometimes questioned these boundaries privately, they rarely challenged them openly. The consequences were social, not just personal. Your family's reputation depended on your behaviour. An ambitious remark could embarrass your parents. A boastful dream could be interpreted as insolence. Children learned to hold their hopes quietly, tucked into corners of the heart the social order couldn't reach. Growing up, you absorbed the rules of class the same way you absorbed language, not consciously, but through constant exposure. You learned what you could ask for, what you could expect, and where you could step without stepping out of bounds. Society didn't need to remind you of your place. You lived in it. You walked it. You breathed it. You respected it, even when you resented it. Ambition existed. Permission didn't. And in 1600s England, that was how you grew up, knowing exactly who you were allowed to become. For most of childhood in 1600s England, life flowed in steady, predictable rhythms. Work, worship, worry, repeat. But every so often, like sunlight breaking through an overcast sky, joy appeared. Not the subtle, quiet joy of a well-cooked meal or a kind gesture. No, this joy arrived loudly, brutally, and with enough energy to make you forget, however briefly, how exhausting ordinary life could be. Happiness showed up occasionally and loudly. Celebrations were rare not because people disliked fun, but because fun required time, resources, and energy. 3 things that daily survival hoarded greedily. So when holidays or fairs finally arrived, they burst onto the landscape with the enthusiasm of a festival that knew it only had one day to make up for an entire year of monotony. The church calendar, unsurprisingly, structured most celebrations. Christmas, Easter, Whitsun, and a handful of saints' days carved small pockets of celebration into the otherwise demanding year. These were the moments when work eased slightly, families gathered and routines loosened just enough to breathe. Even for children who spent most days completing chores or learning their place, holidays felt like stepping through an invisible curtain into a parallel world, one where music replaced commands, feasting replaced rationing, and laughter replaced warnings. Christmas was one of the great highlights. Not the Christmas of modern imagination, with presents wrapped nicely or trees lit by gentle candlelight, but a communal event marked by feasting, visiting neighbours, and attending long church services. Children didn't exchange gifts, but they received treats: apples, nuts, gingerbread if the family could spare the ingredients. The house smelled alive. Adults smiled more readily. Work slowed just enough for children to believe the world had softened. Easter brought its own kind of brightness. After the long sobriety of Lent, families welcomed the return of richer foods. Children enjoyed small traditions, egg-related, games, springtime decorations, and the simple thrill of seeing nature wake up after weeks of grey stillness. Easter marked renewal, not just spiritually but emotionally. You felt it in your bones, as if the warmth finally stretching from sky to soil was reaching into you too. But nothing matched the excitement of a village fair. Fairs were explosions of colour, noise, and chaotic joy. They transformed fields into temporary kingdoms of entertainment and commerce. Merchants arrived from other villages, carrying wares you'd never seen. Musicians played tunes loud enough to drown out your responsibilities. Jugglers, acrobats, and travelling performers turned ordinary air into something sparkling. For a child used to predictable days, the fair felt like magic stepping down from its pedestal and giving you a friendly shove. You might taste foods your family rarely afforded, meat pies, sweet cakes, or roasted nuts. You might watch a puppet show, violent, hilarious, moralistic, or all three. You might see trained animals, fire breathers, or fortune tellers offering glimpses into futures you weren't sure you believed in, but desperately wanted to hear. Fairs didn't just entertain, they expanded the borders of your world, reminding you there was life beyond your village, in shapes stranger and brighter than you imagined. May Day was another cherished festival, especially for children. On the 1st of May, villages decorated with flowers and greenery, celebrating the arrival of spring with dances around the maypole. Children gathered blossoms, wove garlands, and watched or participated in dances that stitched ribbons into elaborate patterns. The entire day felt like a rebellion against winter, a chance to run freely, to laugh loudly, and to feel the sun as something more than a rumour. Harvest festivals offered joy of a different kind, joy rooted in relief. After months of back-breaking work, the gathered crops represented survival secured for another year. Villages held feasts, games, and communal gatherings. Children enjoyed treats made from fresh grain, new ale, and autumn foods reserved for special occasions. For once, the adults' smiles weren't brief. They were deep, tired, grateful smiles that acknowledged victory over uncertainty. But joy in the 1600s wasn't only tied to festivals. It also lived in small, fleeting pockets of daily life. Moments that glowed brighter precisely because they were rare. A warm afternoon without chores, a story told by an elder with dramatic flair, a neighbour sharing a treat, a sibling returning from apprenticeship, a new calf in spring, a snowfall deep enough to justify temporary mischief. These were the joys children cherished quietly, storing them like small treasures. You didn't expect happiness every day. You learned to savour it when it arrived, because it always left quickly, tugged away by work, weather, or obligation. Children developed their own ways of amplifying joy. Even in structured or constrained environments, they found amusement in games, dares, whispered jokes during chores, and competitions involving sticks, stones, or imagination. Joy didn't require toys. It required opportunity. And children were experts in finding those, even when adults weren't looking. Still, the greatest joys remained the ones sanctioned by the community. Holidays and fairs reminded everyone, children and adults alike, that celebration had purpose. It strengthened bonds, lifted spirits, and renewed energy for the months ahead. It marked time not just in seasons, but in emotional cycles. In truth, joy mattered because it was brief. Its rarity intensified it. The contrast between heavy days and bright ones sharpened your awareness of both. Hardship built patience. Celebration built hope. Together they formed the emotional rhythm of growing up in 1600s England. So yes, happiness showed up occasionally, and when it did, it announced itself with bells, ribbons, trumpets, pies, laughter, and the unforgettable sensation that, for one day, you were allowed to simply be a child, unburdened, unhurried, and utterly, gloriously alive. Adolescence in 1600s, England was not a bridge between childhood and adulthood. It was a merge lane. One moment you were a child, clutching a wooden toy or chasing chickens for amusement. The next moment you were expected to behave, work, think, and endure like an adult, minus the privileges, plus the responsibilities. You were young, just not treated that way. By the time you reached 12 or 13, people no longer referred to you as a child. They called you young man, maid, lad, or girl. But these titles carried weight. They implied competence, reliability, and the alarming ability to make decisions without adult supervision. Whether you actually possessed these qualities was irrelevant. Society had decided it was time for you to grow up, and because society said so, you did. Your body might, or body, have barely begun its awkward, confusing transition into adulthood, but socially, you were considered ready for serious work. If you were apprenticed, this was the age when masters began entrusting you with more complex tasks, expecting you to wield tools with precision and judgment instead of trembling novelty. If you worked in agriculture, you graduated from light chores to full field labour, sowing, harvesting, managing livestock, or handling tools sharp enough to make you reconsider your life expectancy. And if you were in domestic service, the work expanded too. Heavier loads, longer hours, larger responsibilities. Your hands, once reserved for fetching crumbs or carrying water, now scrubbed floors, lifted pails, kneaded dough, and soothed crying infants while maintaining perfect composure. Your posture straightened, not because of pride, but because someone older was watching and ready to correct slouching with remarkable speed. Adults didn't ease you into these roles with gentle mentorship. They assumed you had absorbed the skills by watching them, the same way you absorbed language or fear of geese. Observation was your education. Imitation was your examination. When you performed well, adults nodded as if you finally became useful. When you faltered, they barked corrections as if you should have mastered adulthood several years ago. Emotionally, adolescence brought a new layer of restraint. You were encouraged, insisted, really, to hold yourself with dignity, avoid childish outbursts, and demonstrate the self-control expected of a functional adult. If you cried, adults reminded you that such displays were unbecoming at your age. If you sulked, you were told to earn your bread before earning your moods. If you dared to express confusion or frustration, you were reminded that life had little patience for softness. Youth was not a protected category. It was a brief, dissolving moment that ended the instant someone realized your hands were large, enough to grip a tool properly, or your back strong enough to carry a heavy basket without collapsing. Childhood slipped away not through milestones, but through silent moments. Your first full day of uninterrupted labour, your first night staying awake to help through illness, your first task completed without praise because it was now expected. Communities reinforced this shift constantly. Adults watched you with new eyes, evaluating, measuring, predicting your future usefulness. Neighbours asked about your work, commented on your behaviour, or complimented your growing competence with the tone adults used when assessing livestock. Younger children followed you admiringly. Older teens viewed you as competition. Your social world rearranged itself, and you adjusted whether or not you understood it. Apprentices felt this transition especially sharply. Around adolescence, you moved from lowest-ranked helper to true learner, capable of earning respect, albeit slowly, from the master. Your mistakes were no longer charming, they were costly. Your successes weren't celebrated, they were required. Adolescence in a workshop was the difference between being handed tasks and being handed responsibility. Girls faced their own compressed timeline. By adolescence, many were already expected to run partial households, managing siblings, cooking meals, assisting with sewing or spinning, and performing tasks previously reserved for adult women. You might still feel young, but everyone treated you as someone preparing for marriage service or household management. Your future arrived long before your sense of self caught up. Marriage itself hovered in the background of adolescence, not immediate for most, but close enough to shape how people addressed you. Conversations included hints about suitability, behaviour, and skill sets. You were judged not just for who you were, but for who you might soon become. The concept of discovering yourself would have sounded ridiculous to anyone in this era. You discovered nothing. You became what your family, class, and circumstances required. This compression of youth didn't eliminate joy or imagination, but it certainly rearranged them. Adolescents still found ways to laugh, tease, flirt awkwardly, and share secrets. But these moments lived in the cracks between obligations. You smiled in passing, not in lingering reverie. You whispered jokes during chores, not after them. Even courtship, if it began, was quiet, brief, and highly supervised. Yet despite the pressures, adolescence gave children a new sense of pride. You were trusted more. You were capable of real contributions, and people noticed. Adults spoke to you directly, not as a child, but as a person with weight in the world. You felt stronger, sharper, more aware of your place in the community and your value within it. In rare moments, when the day's work ended while some daylight remained, you might sit near a fire or in a field, feeling strangely caught between two worlds, your childhood fading behind you, adulthood rushing ahead. But such moments were fleeting, quickly overtaken by chores, duties, or expectations. Because in 1600s England, adolescence was not a pause, it was an acceleration. You were young, just not treated that way. Growing up in 1600s, England meant growing into adulthood long before your body, mind, or imagination felt ready. There was no moment when someone placed a hand on your shoulder and declared you grown. There was no ceremony to welcome you into maturity. Instead, adulthood arrived as quietly and relentlessly as winter frost, inevitable, unannounced, and deeply woven into the world around you. The good news? You survived growing up in 1600s England. The bad news? You did it by never expecting comfort. Survival shaped everything. Your habits, your outlook, your understanding of what life could and couldn't promise. The hardships of childhood didn't simply challenge you. They built your competencies. Not because struggle was noble, but because struggle was non-negotiable. Every day taught something practical, something necessary, something that tethered you to the realities of a world that demanded endurance more often than joy. By the time you reached adulthood, you carried a lifetime of learned skills, work, obedience, restraint, resilience, and a remarkable ability to adapt. You knew how to tend fires, carry loads, mend clothing, gather harvests, calm younger siblings, navigate social boundaries, withstand hunger, ignore discomfort, respect authority, and endure fear without letting it unravel you. These weren't lessons someone sat down to teach. They accumulated inside you like sediment, layer by layer, until resilience wasn't a trait. It was your foundation. You understood scarcity intimately, not just of food, but of rest, privacy, autonomy, and emotional space. You learned early that comfort rarely appeared on its own. It had to be carved out, of circumstance, defended fiercely and enjoyed briefly before vanishing again. You didn't resent this. You didn't even question it. Life with minimal comfort was the only life you knew. Yet your world wasn't bleak. It was vibrant in ways hardship couldn't erase. You experienced joy, precious, concentrated, memorable. You felt belonging, woven through community ties, shared meals, whispered jokes, and winter nights spent beside hearths that burned too low, but glowed warmly nonetheless. You held moments of delight as tightly as you held tools, because they mattered just as much. And adulthood itself wasn't a grim destiny. It was a continuation of the same determined spirit that carried you through childhood. If anything, adulthood felt strangely familiar. The work you did, the sacrifices you made, the responsibilities you held, these were simply extended versions of what you'd been doing for years. Growing up in 1600s, England didn't prepare you for adulthood. It was adulthood. Childhood had been a short apprenticeship to survival. Adulthood became its lifelong practice. As a grown person, you stepped fully into roles you'd been shadowing since you were barely tall enough to carry a bucket. You contributed meaningfully to your family's welfare. You navigated social expectations with the ease of someone who had spent their entire life rehearsing them. And you accepted the burdens and constraints placed upon you, not because you lacked imagination, but because the world demanded pragmatism. Still, adulthood offered something childhood did not: agency. You could make decisions, small ones perhaps, but meaningful nonetheless. You chose when to rise, how to divide your labour, how to discipline your children, how to worship, how to treat neighbours, and how to carve out small corners of comfort in a world not built to offer them freely. And you found satisfaction in your competence. Growing up had taught you to rely on yourself, to read the land, the weather, the expressions of others. It taught you to predict trouble, respond to needs, and contribute to the shared rhythm of village or household life. You were not fragile. You were not unprepared. You were the product of a childhood that valued function over fantasy. Resilience became your inheritance, the quiet legacy of a world that forged strength through necessity. You learned that life was less about comfort and more about continuity, keeping the fire going, the bread rising, the roof patched, the community intact. And in this continuity you found meaning, not the dramatic, poetic kind, the steady, grounding kind. Looking back on your childhood from the vantage of adulthood, you might recognize how intense it was, how little room it left for softness, exploration, or indulgence. You might recall hunger, fear, labour, and loss with a pang of emotion you didn't allow yourself at the time. But you would also remember the laughter, the festivals, the companionship of siblings and neighbours, the moments of triumph when a task mastered felt like a mountain climbed. Because growing up in 1600s, England didn't erase joy. It made joy sharper. It didn't eliminate hope. It made hope durable. It didn't suppress imagination. It made imagination vital, the spark that kept your mind alive during long hours and darker seasons. In the end, survival shaped you, not just physically, but emotionally, socially, and spiritually. You learned to stand in a world where guarantees were rare, dangers constant, and comforts fleeting, and you learned to persevere anyway. The good news? You survived growing up in 1600s England. The bad news? You did it by never expecting comfort. But perhaps the deeper truth is this. Your ability to endure made adulthood not just possible, but meaningful. Your resilience was not accidental. It was earned, one hard day after another, until it became the quiet strength you carried into the rest of your life. And that strength, born from a childhood of relentless adaptation, was the one gift no hardship could take away.